Oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan.
There is a separate consciousness inside of you. We like to call it the ego. And it does things faster than you do, and its only job is to keep your meat alive. Unfortunately, it's dumb. So it doesn't understand what's a threat and what's not a threat, but it's doing its best. So you can harness that, and you can say, I'm going to show you with neurofeedback what it.
So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. Because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. But once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really, in many ways, that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that. And then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that, obviously. The goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, you know, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? You know, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. But, you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. So, you know, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating.
¿Sabes qué tienen en común las personas más felices y más competentes del mundo? Que todos
One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially.
Y me parece que Marisa, que aunque eres muy humilde, creo que estás luchando para cambiar esto, para cambiar esta especie de adicción.
We focus on the idea of happiness too much, and the problem with that is that it takes our focus away from aims that would be more productive. It's much better to aim for meaning than for happiness. Best bet is truth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's always going to do the trick, right? I mean, sometimes you go fight a dragon and it eats you, and if you being eaten wasn't a real possibility, it wouldn't be a real fight. And so you see people, like I've seen people in my clinical practice sometimes. I had one client in particular who was undergoing a particularly vicious divorce with someone who was really seriously inclined to take him out and would do pretty much everything at her disposal to do so. And I strategized with him for about 3 years, and we did everything, and hyper carefully. He was a very conscientious and diligent person, and he put into practice everything that we discussed and strategized, and he still he got backed into a corner so hard that I didn't know how to help him anymore. So I would say, however, that he was a very truthful person throughout that, and one thing he did do was, part of it was a custody battle, and he did manage, despite his decline, in consequence of being repeatedly cornered, I would say, he did manage to establish what I think was a lasting relationship with his kids. So he might have got enough out of what he did to justify it, even though the whole landscape was pretty awful. I think that not lying is your best bet, but life is hard and people get run over, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to emerge in any obvious sense triumphant. But if you take the alternative path, especially when you're facing severe tribulations, let's say, and you complicate those with deceit, you can be sure that whatever tragedy that you're confronting is going to turn into not only tragedy, but something very much akin to hell. And so you might be able to at least minimize the degree of suffering, even if you can't overcome it or transcend it. And that's something, you know.
There is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. But you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. It's like the first thing you want to do is dispense with the idea that you get to have any permanent security outside of your ability to contend and adapt. It's the same issue with children. It's like you're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. And you might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
And if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years you'll be much more miserable and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children, they have payments and loans. It's a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly. I've dealt with hundreds of people in my clinical and consulting practice, and we set a goal, we develop a vision and work towards it, and things inevitably get better for people. So it's not a luxury, it's difficult. It's a moral responsibility, and it isn't happiness. It's not, the pursuit isn't for happiness.
It's a moral responsibility to pursue what is meaningful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The more radical the necessary change, the more pain that accompanies it. Like the more opportunity as well. And a lot of what we learn painfully. And so it's not surprising that people shrink away from learning. We learn in pain and anxiety very frequently. Everyone knows that. Like the things that you really learned in life, it's like, it was no joy, man. Like it took you out. And so the fact that people flee from that is hardly surprising. But it doesn't help, that's the thing. It just stores up the catastrophe for later. And so the better idea is to eat a little poison every day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. It's something like that. And it is the case that I think because you aren't forced to, first of all, you don't learn unless you're forced to learn. I know there's alternatives to that. There's the voluntary search for knowledge, and that's a fine thing, and that is an antidote to this. But apart from that, speaking more practically, you tend not to learn unless you're forced to learn, and what you tend to learn by force are difficult lessons. And so people are very prone to not seek that out. It's not surprising, but it's because they don't understand the consequences very well. You know, it's because they're convinced that there's some way of forestalling the necessary learning, and there isn't any way of forestalling it. All you do is make it worse in the future. You make yourself smaller, and you make the lesson harder. And so that's why in so many religious doctrines there's emphasis on humility. You know, and humility isn't to debase yourself. It's to understand that you don't know enough so that your life isn't going to be miserable. And so every chance you get to grab something new that will help you along your way, you should take it as fast as you can. But you have to have a very tragic, I would say, view of reality, and also a harsh one, because it's not just tragedy, it's also malevolence. You have to understand that those are waiting for you, and that makes you desperate enough to learn, and that might make you desperate enough to fall out of your ideology. But that's a hard way of looking at the world. It beats living through it, though. Continual circling, in some sense, of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. So you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take a, you know, it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you know, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because like, what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful.
We're built for struggle, us human beings. You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And you know, people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You know, you're doing fine in life, and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do.
It helps to read a lot. It really helps to write. So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about, you know. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university, because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading, because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some techniques, let's say. Is like if you're speaking in front of a group, You are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably not, because it's too intimidating. But there isn't 1,000 people there. There's 1,000 individuals. And so you just look at an individual and you say something, and you can tell if they're engaged. They look confused, or they look interested, or they look angry, or they look bored, or maybe they're asleep, in which case you look at someone else. And they give you feedback about how you're doing. And so one thing is to have something to say, yeah, but the next thing is pay attention to who you're talking to. Because unless you're very badly socialized, and that seems unlikely in your case, because you present yourself at least moderately well, and well, I mean, I don't know you very well, but on first sight, you're doing fine. So the probability that if you pay attention to the individuals that you're talking to, that your natural wealth of social skill will manifest itself is extremely high. And so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience. So the last thing I would say is, well, having the aim to be a good communicator is a good start. And you think, well, I could buttress that to some degree. Well, there isn't anything that you can possibly, this is the whole point of a liberal education, there isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. So, and this is something that the liberal arts colleges, I think, I don't know if they've forgotten it, but they don't do a very good job of marketing. It's like, well, what's the use of a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts? It's like, well, you can think, you can write, you can speak, you've read something. It's like, the economic value of that is incalculable. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful they have skills. Clearly, that's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful. Well, that's kind of like the definition of success in life, right? You negotiate and you're successful. It doesn't mean you win. Because if you're a good negotiator, if you're a really good negotiator, everybody walks away from the negotiation thrilled. And so then people line up to do things with you. So, and that's all dependent on your ability to communicate. So practice. There's a great hunger for information that is practical and useful and that helps people find meaning in their lives and orient themselves. There's a great hunger for that. And most of my lectures were derived from solid psychology, some of it experimental, some of it biological, some of it from the domains of neuroscience, a lot of it from great clinicians. It's not surprising that people find it helpful because, well, great clinicians were great because they were really helpful. And so to distill that and to offer it to people in a digestible form, to have that have a good effect on them, well, that's what you'd expect. That's what the whole discipline is about. And so that's been great. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. Because if you're comparing yourself to someone else, I mean, first of all, you don't know very much about the life of the person you're comparing yourself to. You don't know it across all of its dimensions. And second, people are very different. And so comparing yourself to someone else, it's kind of useful, I guess, when you're young. But as you get older and more singular and more particular, it becomes increasingly less useful. Better to compare yourself to a previous version of yourself and work for improvement in that way. Here's an impossible thing. Why don't you go out and fail? You say, here's something worth going after. Here's a step you could take that would push you beyond where you are, but that you also have a reasonably high probability of succeeding at, right? They call that
within a time frame.
Within some time frame. That's the other thing. You have to parameterize it with regards to time frame. That's right. And that puts you in the zone of proximal development. And that's a concept that was generated by a guy named Vygotsky. He was a Russian developmental psychologist and a smart one. It's where the idea of the zone comes from, to be in the zone.
Yes.
And when you're in the zone, you're expanding your skills in a manner that's intrinsically rewarding because you're succeeding. And so you want to set, if you're good to yourself, you think, okay, I need to set a goal, but I need to set a goal that someone as stupid and useless as me could probably attain if they put some effort into it.
Right.
And then you've got it perfectly, because it's not so high that it's grandiose or impossible that you fail necessarily and then justify your bitterness. It's like, well, I could do, well, because that happens to people.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, it's like,
See this all the time.
you know, it's like, yes, exactly. Well, I set a goal and I didn't attain it, so I'm not going to set any more goals.
Right.
It's like, no, you set a goal that was inappropriate.
For the time frame. Yeah.
That's right. You didn't calibrate it properly.
Yeah.
And you're playing a trick on yourself because you wanted to fail so that you could justify not having to try.
And being a victim. Yeah.
Which isn't helpful. You're still going to be a victim. It's like, there's no way out of that, man. Yeah. So, you know, because life is a challenge that in some sense can't be surmounted. So there's no way out of your problem. But there are certainly proper ways of dealing with it. Yeah. Life is difficult, and you cannot protect your children. What you can do is prepare them, and you can prepare them to be strong and courageous and truthful and resilient and reciprocal in their interactions with other people. And that means you equip them for what life will be, which is at minimum a series of difficult challenges, and often more than that, because of course people go through very difficult times in their lives. And a resilient person is capable of standing up to things in the face of fear and moving forward voluntarily, convinced of their own competence and ability to prevail. And so your primary goal as a parent, apart from facilitating your child's social desirability, which is a major obligation on your part, is to encourage your children and I mean that literally, to instill in them a sense of courage in the face of the difficulties of life, and not to protect them from that. We don't even want to be protected from those difficulties, because a major part of life and its meaning is the challenge that comes with confronting difficulties. There is definitely an epidemic of overprotective parenting. But it's useful to ask why. And my suspicions is that this is driven by very fundamental biological and cultural phenomena that aren't generally considered in relationship to this issue. We don't have very many children. We don't have 12, 6 of whom die. We have 1 or 2, and that makes them very precious, right? We're unwilling to take risks with them, and no wonder. And then we also have them much later in life. And so, like, if you have a kid when you're 18, you're still a kid. You're going to go out and have your life, right? Because you're you're in the height of your exploratory. You're in the height of the exploratory part of your life. You're not going to overprotect your kid because you're still a kid. But if you're 40 and you have 1 child, it's like all your eggs are in one basket. Yeah. And the probability that you're going to take undue risks with that precious person is very, very low. Now, obviously, there's some advantages to that because, great, you devote resources to your child, and foster their development. But the downside is that you have every motivation to hover. And maybe you're also extraordinarily desperate as a mother to maintain that bond with your child because you've struggled so long to achieve it. It's highly, highly valuable. You can't take a risk. Well, so you might say, well, perhaps overprotective parenting is a secondary and unintended consequence of the birth control pill and the fact that people now have children later in life. Could easily be. If you have 6 kids, it's like, what are you going to do? Helicopter parent them? It's like, no, you're so tired you can't even get off the couch if you have 6 kids. And they outnumber you, right? They're raising each other. They're competing and they're taking each other down a peg. There's no overprotection there. But with a single child landscape or dual child landscape, mostly a single child landscape, then you're going to overprotect. And then that ethos starts to permeate the schools, and it starts to permeate the higher education institutions as those children mature. And then that all reinforces it. It's not good. It's not obvious what to do about it either, because if it is driven by demographics in that sense, it's a much more intractable problem than we think. So I did some of that in 12 Rules for Life. You know, I said, look, what you have to understand is that you're a danger to your children no matter what, right? You can let them go out in the world and be hurt, or you can overprotect them and hurt them that way. So here's your choice. You can make your children competent and courageous, or you can make them safe. But you can't make them safe because life isn't safe. So if you sacrifice their courage and competence on the altar of safety, then you disarm them completely. And all they can do is pray to be protected. You have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. That you have a certain delightful, wonderful, positive freedom as a child, and then that's given up as you approach adulthood. But the truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic, way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life, and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that, and they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, if you think about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah.
That's
you're not
better.
Like guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've justified your existence, right? And so you're not waking up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied,
what
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so, if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience perhaps is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic and and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to, but you're not living up to your full potential. And so there's an existential weight that goes along with that.
People have an unspecified potential for development, educationally, obviously, with regards to the skills they have, but also in relationship to their character. And it's much more encouraging for people, I think, to concentrate on who they could be rather than who they are, especially when they're young, because they still have most of their life ahead of them, and they're not everything they could be yet. And so to tell people even something like, well, you should feel good about yourself the way you are, it's like, well, that there's something there that's seriously lacking, because there's so much more that you could be, that you need to be, and that you should be aiming at. The problem with being okay the way you are is that you don't have a goal then. And people need to have a goal in order to come to terms with their life.
The baboon here, who's supposed to be basically just a fool when the story was first written, he turned into what's essentially a shaman across time. So he represents the self from the Jungian perspective. Now, the self is everything you could be across time. So imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is, And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. Because people will say to you, you should live up to your potential. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information, right? Because you build yourself out of the information in the Piagetian sense. But it's deeper than that too, because we know that if you take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. So it's not merely that you're incorporating information from the outside world in the constructivist sense. It's that by exposing yourself to different environments, you put different physiological demands on yourself all the way down to the genetic level, and that manifests new elements of you. And so one of the things that happens to people, and this is a very common cultural notion, is that you should go on a pilgrimage at some point to somewhere central, and that would be, say, like the rock in the Pride Rock in The Lion King, because you take yourself out of your dopey little village, and that's just the little bounded you that everyone knows and that isn't very expanded, and then you go somewhere dark and dangerous to the central place, and while you do that, you have adventures, and they toughen you and pull more out of you, like partly because you're becoming informed, which means information. It means you're becoming more organized at every level of analysis, but there's also more of you too.
Primary motive as a clinical psychologist and educator is to help individuals live more meaningful and productive lives in harmony with their families and their community. That's my motive. And the evidence for that, I think, is, well, if people go online, and first of all, you can watch the lectures and decide for yourself, but you can also go, I suspect probably maybe 250,000 people have commented on the lectures and their effects on them. And so that's what people say. I'm watching the lectures. Yeah. I'm trying to develop a vision for my life. I'm trying to become more responsible, and it's really helping. And that's what I hear all the time when I do these public lectures, like which aren't political.
But when we gain success, we raise the bar. We set our ambitions higher. I mean, what is your end game? What do you want?
That's all. That's what I want. I want to help as many individuals as possible become more courageous, more truthful, and more engaged in the pursuit of individual, familial, and social harmony. That's what I want.
A great job of modeling courage in the face of fire.
Well, there's something I'd like to say, maybe in closing, about courage. People say that to me, and I don't think it's exactly right, There's a line in the Old Testament, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I think it's more like that. It's not that I'm courageous, it's that I'm afraid of the right things. So when I made my videos, it wasn't like that didn't make me nervous. But I was less nervous about going back to bed and not saying what I had to say than I was about making the videos. Because I know where this is going. I don't want to go there. And so it's not so much courage, it's that it's a matter of, it's less risky to say something than to remain silent when you know there's something to be said. I know that to be the case. And so lots of times in life, it's like, there's no pathway forward that's going to shield you from risk. You get to pick this risk, or you get to pick this risk. And I think I picked the lesser risk. And that might be wise, but I'm not so sure it's courageous. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. This is a chapter about conversation and about the different forms conversation takes. And it's a chapter about humility. And it's a chapter about listening. And the humility element is, it took me a long time to understand why there's religious injunctions supporting humility, but to even understand what the word really meant in that sort of technical sense. And it means something like this. It means what you don't know is more important than what you know. And that's a lovely thing to, then what you don't know can start to be your friend, you see. People are very defensive about what they know, and for the reasons we've already discussed. But the thing is, you don't know enough. And you can tell you don't know enough because your life is not what it could be, and neither is the life of the people around you. You just don't know enough. And so what that means is that every time you encounter some evidence that you're ignorant, someone points it out, you should be happy about that because you think, oh, you just told me how I'm wrong. It's like, great. Like maybe I had to sift through a lot of nonsense to get through the real message that you're telling me. But if you could actually tell me some way that I'm wrong, and then maybe give me a hint about how to not be wrong like that, well, then I wouldn't have to be wrong like that anymore. That would be a good thing. And you can embark on that adventure by listening to people. And if you listen to people, they'll tell you amazing things if you listen to them. And many of those things are little tools that you can put in your toolkit, like Batman, and then you can go out into the world and use those tools, and you don't have to fall blindly into a pit quite as often. And so the humility element is, well, do you want to be right, or do you want to be learning? And it's deeper than that. It's, do you want to be the tyrannical king who's already got everything figured out, or do you want to be the continually transforming hero, or fool for that matter, who's getting better all the time? And that's actually a choice, you know. It's a deep choice, and it's better to be the self-transforming fool who's humble enough to make friends with what he or she doesn't know, and to listen when people talk. And listening is a transformative exercise. Like if you listen to the people in your life, for example, if you actually listen to them, they'll tell you what's wrong with them and how to fix it and what they want. They can't even help it if you start listening, because people are so shocked if you actually listen to them that they tell you all sorts of things that they might not have even intended to, things they don't even know. And then you can work with that.
Buscamos en otros planetas lo que no cuidamos en el nuestro. Por eso creamos la sección de productos sustentables, para que cada vez seamos más los que compramos pensando en todos. Mercado Libre. Lo mejor está llegando.
Hola, pa. Te presento a Joaquín. Somos novios.
¿Y a qué te dedicas?
Hago sillas, señor.
This lecture is called Virtue as a Necessity. And the reason I gave it that title is because virtue, ethics, morality isn't a field of study. It's a mode of being upon which all fields of study rest. It's also a mode of being on which everything you do in your life rests. The way you understand yourself or fail to, the way you understand other people or fail to, And more deeply than that, what role it is that you play in your life in the world. One of the things I've learned, for example, being a clinical psychologist, I spent thousands of hours helping people sort out difficult problems, is that lack of virtue makes people ill. I'm not saying that my clients themselves lack virtue. I suppose some of them do and some of them don't, but to the degree that they're embedded in a network of relationships where virtue is fundamentally absent, they're tortured and tormented and they're unable to find firm ground. And that's not a biological problem, even though biologically fragile people might be hurt more by a lack of virtue. A lot of what you do in a real relationship with people, and at least to some degree a clinical relationship is supposed to be real, is provide a forum where people tell the truth. And that's hard because people don't like to tell the truth particularly. The truth is difficult. It's difficult for a variety of reasons. So when I first thought about this lecture, I had a slightly different title. The title was Virtue as an Existential Necessity. And that's a bit philosophical, so I modified it. But there was a reason for that, because the concept of virtue means to be virtuous, and existentialism is the study of being, right? And I think that you can't really understand what makes up virtue until you modulate or modify your notion of what constitutes being. This is a hard thing to do. Modern people are fundamentally materialistic. And there's some utility in that. We're masters of material transformation. And the fact that we're materialist in our scientific philosophies has made us extremely powerful, maybe too powerful for our morality, extremely powerful from a technological perspective, but it's blinded us to certain things. And I think one of the things that it's really blinded us to is the nature of our own being. Because we make the assumption that the fundamental constituent elements of reality are material, we fail to notice that the fundamental constituent elements of our own reality are not material. They're emotional, they're motivational, they're dreams, they're visions, they're relationships with other people. They're conscious, they're dependent on consciousness and self-consciousness. And we have absolutely no materialist explanation whatsoever, either for consciousness or self-consciousness. And we don't deal well from a materialistic perspective with the qualities of being. And everyone knows those qualities exist. I mean, for most people, there's nothing more real than their own pain, right? Pain transcends rational argument in that you can't argue yourself out of it. It's just there. And materialist or not, there's very few people that are willing to allow the claim that their pain is merely an epiphenomenon of some more fundamental material process. Pain is fundamental, consciousness is fundamental. And I think that unless you understand that, you can't think properly about virtue. So I might start the discussion of virtue with the discussion of being. Well, what does human being look like? Well, the Buddhists say life is suffering. That's the first fundamental Buddhist dictum. And I suppose a modern person would tend to think of that as a very pessimistic claim. But I've found when I've shared that information with my students, once they understand what it means, it's actually a relief, because people run around madly suffering away, and all of them inside their little shell think, well, there must be something wrong with me, because here I am suffering, and I mean, that isn't how things are supposed to be. Well, then you might say, who says that's not the way things are supposed to be? The Buddhists say life is suffering. So what that means is if you're not suffering, that's a good thing, that's lucky, that's fortunate. That's not the way of the world. That may be something to be grateful for, ecstatic about even. And of course, in Christianity, the central symbol of Christianity is a crucifix, which is not a positive symbol in any way. It's a symbol of betrayal by friends, opposition from the state, and mortal vulnerability. It's about as powerful a symbolic representation of the idea that life is suffering as you can put together, which is, of course, why the power of that symbol extends across several thousand years. Judaism, well, I don't think it's going to come as a shock to anybody in the audience that Jews are acutely aware of the suffering that's involved in life. So
the first thing you want to ask your partner or your family is
to understand what it means that life is suffering. It's a fundamental ontological truth. It's a fundamental statement about the nature of being. And there's a reason for that. It's not incomprehensible. It's perfectly comprehensible. We're finite, right? We have a lifespan that's bounded temporally. You're going to live maybe 100 years, and that'll pretty much be it. And then there's other forms of extreme limitation that are imposed on you that have very little to do with you. They're arbitrary facts of being. You're a certain height, you're a certain weight, you're a certain amount of attractive, you're a certain amount of intelligent, you're a certain amount of athletic, you're a certain amount of mentally ill, you're a certain amount of predisposition to cancer. And it's frequently the case that people like to attribute those vulnerabilities to some flaw in their own nature, but what they are instead are conditions of existence. Human being is predicated on a kind of fundamental limitation in that we are what we are and we're not other things. And so that means inevitably that the awareness of human being comes along with suffering. And life poses the question, how to conduct yourself in the face of suffering, not only yours, but everyone else's. And it's an inescapable question, except that maybe you're fortunate and you'll have periods of time where something absolutely horrible isn't happening to you. Now, you think about this, because you might think this is pessimistic, but it's not pessimistic. It's actually one of the most freeing things that you can realize. Maybe there's nothing particularly wrong with you at the moment, but there's a high probability that you have a family member that has something seriously wrong with them. And there's a very high probability that if you don't, you will soon. Or maybe you'll have a partner that has something serious wrong with them. And to know this frees you from the false illusion that life can be conducted without suffering. Suffering's an integral part of being. Now, why is that? Well, who knows? It's a metaphysical question. But I have some ideas about that that have helped me, and they're things that I've read. I read, for example, an old Jewish commentary about the reason for creation. And it's like a Zen koan, this idea. You take a being with the classical attributes of God, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. Right? It's a totality. And the question is, well, what does a being with those attributes lack? And the answer is limitation. And then you think, well, what's so important about limitation? Well, if you can be anything or do anything at any time whatsoever, there's no being, because everything is one thing. There's no differentiation between things. So something that's absolute and total has no being. It has to be parceled out into limited being. And you know this because you'll all play games. You play video games, you play games with other people. You may play games you don't even know you're playing. And when you play those games, you put limits on yourself. You play by a set of rules, and the reason you do that is when you limit yourself, arbitrarily in some ways, whole new worlds of possibility emerge. And so there's a powerful metaphysical idea that being is not possible without limitation. So that's an interesting question. That's an interesting idea. So you say, well, what's the price you pay for being? The price you pay for being is limitation, and the price you pay for limitation is suffering. So the price you pay for being is suffering. So what's the problem with that? Well, suffering makes people question the validity of life. Right? Everyone does that. If something terrible is happening to you, you're going to wonder why you, that's for sure. Why not you might be a better question, because it's inevitable, but you will wonder that, why you? And you'll wonder, well, is it worth it? Especially if what's happening to you is terrible and prolonged. Is it worth it? Does the cost that you have to pay for being justify itself? And therefore, is being justifiable? And everybody asks and answers these questions. In fact, the process of asking and answering those questions underlies everything you do all the time, because you're answering, when you act, one answer, which is yes, being justifies itself, and you're answering a different way sometimes when you act, which is no, being does not justify itself. And the question then might be, well, what happens when you answer one of those two ways? Well, To untangle this, the first thing I want to do is to talk to you about the antithesis of virtue. Because it's always struck me that when you're talking about something that could conceivably be regarded as optimistic, it's difficult for people to fundamentally believe you. You know, if I stood on stage and said, well, the purpose of life is to be happy, you might find that vaguely comforting, but there's not a chance in the world that you'd believe it if you have an ounce of sense. Because if you've lived, you know that there will be periods of time where happiness is not your state. And so there has to be more to life than happiness, because there'll be a lot of your life that isn't happy. Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the book, The Gulag Archipelago, that was one of the axes that brought down the thick tree of communist utopianism, said of the idea that human beings are made for happiness, he said that's a philosophy that's undermined by the first blow of the work assigner's cudgel. And what he meant by that was, if you find yourself in a particularly terrible situation, if you're enslaved, for example, by malevolent utopians, and they're pushing you into a form of slavery and they're beating you to attain their ends, the idea that you're made for happiness is not going to be of much comfort under those circumstances. And so Solzhenitsyn's point was, you're weakened by your belief that life is for happiness, because that philosophy cannot sustain any sustained challenge, and you will for sure encounter such a sustained challenge. I don't think that modern people can believe in virtue, but not easily, because virtue sounds religious in a sense, and we have real trouble, whether we're religious or not, with religious preconceptions, because our scientific forms of knowledge and our fundamental materialism has really radically undermined our ability to believe in any transcendent being. But one thing that modern people can believe in, I think without much difficulty at all, is evil. Solzhenitsyn said, for example, that the most important event of the 20th century, as far as he was concerned, was the Nuremberg judgment. And you may know, you should know, that after World War II, a group of National Socialists from Germany, who were deemed particularly responsible for the absolute horrors of the final solution and the mass factory genocide that accompanied it, were put on trial. And a standard defense for their actions was, well, I was ordered to do it. And the Nuremberg decision denied human beings, regardless of their ethnicity or national background or beliefs, the legal right to use that as a defense under certain limited circumstances. And the argument was, there are some things that are so self-evidently not good, not virtuous, that if you engage in them, you're existentially guilty. You're guilty outside the bounds of your culture. There's a transnational and transethnic morality. We don't know what it is, but we know what it isn't. It isn't pointless torture and genocide. At minimum, to be virtuous is to live your life in such a way that the probability that you would engage in such actions, given the opportunity, is minimized. Now, people think, well, they're already doing that, because if they were in Nazi Germany, they would have been a rescuer, not a perpetrator, but that's wrong. You could take this audience and put them back in 1939 or thereabouts, and 90% of you would, 95% of you, 99% of you, would either be in the perpetrator class or the going along with the perpetrator class. And you may sit and believe that you'd be in the 1%. Maybe you would, because how do I know? But that isn't how the historical facts sort themselves out. And it turns out that it's not that difficult generally to put people in a situation, normal people, where they'll do something that really doesn't look very good. Those of you who are familiar with psychology know about the Milgram experiments, for example, know about the Zimbardo prison experiments. You take perfectly normal college students and put them into a situation that they know is a dramatic farce, they know isn't real, give some of them the power of prison guards and make some others arbitrarily into prisoners, and in 3 days you have to shut the whole experiment down because the prison guards have turned into Nazis and they're enjoying torturing the prisoners even though they know, whatever know means, that they're innocent. Well, that says something about the manner in which people conduct their existence. They're very susceptible to malevolent action. If you look at Genesis, a very old book and very influential book, there's a strange sequence of events that befalls Adam and Eve, right? It's in 2 sentences. A snake gives them an apple, and that wakes them up. Well, there's a good book by a Southern California primatologist that was just published last year that suggests that the reason that humans have such great vision, way better than most animals except for raptors, birds, is because our visual systems were designed to detect predatory snakes. And the way she discovered that was by comparing the populations of predatory snakes around the world to the visual acuity of the primate groups that lived in those areas. And what she found was essentially a one-to-one correspondence. Our visual system, which is the ability to see and to be enlightened, let's say, because enlightenment, for example, is associated with vision, the snake gave that to us because we had to pay attention to predatory things that were after us for tens of millions of years. And fruit, that's interesting. We have color vision because we were fruit eaters. Our color vision is precisely evolved to detect ripe fruit. So that part of the story is right. There's a story that involves women too, but I'm not going to tell that one today. You have to be awake to outsmart women. That's the story. And so that's why they're tangled in there with the serpents and the fruit. And what happens when Adam and Eve wake up? Well, it's a series of strange things. The first thing that happens is the scales fall from their eyes so they can see. All of a sudden they're awake in a way they weren't before. And the next thing that happens is they realize they're naked. Now, one of the things that people have nightmares about is being naked on a stage, which is often why when you see people on a stage, they don't tell you anything they think. Because they don't only not want to be physically naked, they don't want to be metaphysically naked either. And they protect themselves from the inquiring eyes of the audience. No one likes to be naked on stage. Why? Well, to be naked is to have your defenses stripped from you. When the Soviets wanted to really torture the hell out of you at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'd stave in your door, and then they'd strip you and shave you when they got you to prison, because once you were exposed in all your suffering catastrophe, then you were much easier to torture. To be naked, to realize you're naked, is to realize that you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. That's why Adam and Eve immediately cover themselves up, right? They realize they're naked, they cover themselves up. It's a story about culture. Once people woke up and realized their limitations, their mortal limitations, which is also their knowledge of death, the first thing they do is cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens is they know the difference between good and evil. And that's a strange thing. It's not good and bad. It's good and evil specifically. It's also something that animals don't know. And I thought about this really for 20 years. What does that mean? And then earlier this year, I think I figured it out. I think what it means is you don't know how to torture people until you realize that you're vulnerable. As soon as you're self-conscious of your own vulnerability, then you can take what might only be a predatory act, say on the part of a wolf, because a wolf will bring down a moose or something like that and eat it, and drag that out into 3 months of artistic torturing. And so that means that your recognition of your own vulnerability immediately allows you to determine what's evil. Well, so then you might ask yourself, well, under what conditions would you be likely to manifest that drive? Well, I think that's easy to figure out if you watch yourself. You know, if you watch yourself without presupposition, which means to watch yourself honestly, or to watch yourself as if you're someone you don't know, because you don't know yourself, because you're too complicated to know yourself anyway, so you might as well just come right out and know that. I mean, one of the things that's kind of useful about recognizing your capacity for evil, if you can do that without traumatizing yourself, is that it's the pathway to recognizing your ability for good. You don't get to one without the other. Because you have no idea what you're like before you know how terrible you can be. And not only that, you won't take yourself sufficiently seriously. If you know you're a loaded weapon, and an unstable loaded weapon, then you're much more likely to pay attention to what you do. But that means you're not particularly nice. And it means that if you were given the opportunity, maybe you would have been a Nazi prison guard. Now, in Genesis, the first thing that happens after Adam and Eve wake up is they have two sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain, who's Abel's brother, he doesn't get along very well with God. Now, I don't really care if you believe in God, because I don't know what people mean when they say they believe in God anyways, but the story goes that Cain doesn't get along very well with God, and the reason for that is Cain keeps doing things, and they don't work. Everything Cain touches turns to ash, whereas his brother Abel, God likes him, God only knows why, and everything goes real well for Abel, and so Cain is kind of a failure. And Abel's a smashing success, and not only is he successful at everything he does, but he's a good guy too, which is really rude, because if you're really successful at things, you should at least be wretched interpersonally so that people can forgive you. So Cain takes this for, a decade or two, and then he's just had it. He's had it with God. He thinks, how could God make this sort of universe where I'm, breaking myself in half here and getting nowhere, and my brother's doors open for him left, right, and center. So he goes and complains to God. He says, look, what's going on here? What sort of reality did you conjure up here? Abel has it good. I'm having a miserable time. Maybe you should do something about that. And you think that's pretty interesting, that Cain would think that, because you have to ask yourself, what sort of presumption does Cain have to assume that the dismal quality of his being is attributable to God? Because what Cain does in that instant is to make himself the judge of being. And I would say that you should be cautious about making yourself the judge of being, because there's always the possibility that there's a few things that you don't know. So God sort of lets Cain in on the secret. He says, look, the fact that you're suffering miserably away actually isn't my fault. It's your fault. He says to Cain, sin crouches at the door like a predatory cat ready to jump on you, but if you wanted to, you could overcome it. This is not what Cain wants to hear. Cain wants to hear that he's an innocent character and he has nothing to do with his own misery and it's all God's fault. And God says instead, straighten the hell up. You know you could do it. And even though you know you could do it, you won't. And so that's that for Cain. He was upset when he first went into the discussion, but after he got this little piece of news that his suffering was to be laid at his own doorstep, then he's out of the realm of human, and the story says his countenance falls, which means he's angry and upset. And the first thing he does is run off and kill Abel. Why? Well, it's revenge. Right? Abel is God's favorite, and Cain has already judged being and found it wanting, and the best way that he can express his desire for revenge is to find someone who's having a pretty good time of it and to arbitrarily eliminate them. And it might be of some interest to note that one of Cain's grandchildren is the first person who makes weapons of war. So that brilliant little story so long ago associates the moral failings of the resentful individual who's unwilling to take responsibility for the nature of their own being directly with atrocious acts of social conflict. And that's another thing to know, because if you're going to be virtuous, you have to take yourself seriously. And if you start to understand that you're networked with other people, you're not one little dot among 7 billion, you're networked with other people, so you know 1,000 people and they know 1,000 people, and so you're 2 people away from 1 million people and 3 people away from 1 billion people. You're in a causal network and all of your actions matter. And Solzhenitsyn said there's as many centers of the universe as there are individual consciousnesses. And that's a very interesting way to think, and why can't it be that way? We don't know anything about consciousness, and it certainly seems to be how it feels if you're one of those conscious centers, and so maybe it is that what you do matters. I think that often people come to the conclusion that life is meaningless because that's a better conclusion to come to than the reverse. Because if life is meaningless, well, then who cares what you do? But if life is meaningful, if what you do matters, then everything you do matters. And that puts a terrible responsibility on the individual. And I think that people are generally unwilling to bear that. So life is suffering. What does that do to people? It makes them resentful. These are pitfalls of being. He said being has a structure. One of its fundamental structural elements is suffering, but suffering produces other characteristics of being. Resentment is a characteristic of being. People feel resentful when they believe that they've been taken advantage of. And maybe if you feel resentful, it may be that you're being taken advantage of. It may also be that you should screw your head on straight and look at things properly. And it may also be that you should talk to somebody to find out if you're being taken advantage of, or if your head just isn't screwed on straight. But to talk to them, then you have to tell them the truth. And in order to tell them the truth, you have to have practiced being honest. Because if you haven't practiced being honest, then you're not going to have a friend you can talk to. And even if you did, you won't be able to tell them what the problem is. And then they won't be able to help you sort out whether or not you're being taken advantage of, or whether you're a little bit insane. If you're resentful, then maybe you have to tell the person who's taking advantage of you that they should stop doing that. And maybe you have to tell them in a way that will make them stop, which is no easy thing. Or maybe you're resentful because you're a nasty little bit of the world and you have a chip on your shoulder, and no matter what people do with you, you're resentful, in which case you have some internal restructuring to do. And you might ask, well, why should you do the restructuring? And the answer to that is that, well, resentment, along with hopelessness and nihilism and all sorts of other moral pitfalls, puts you on the road to cruelty and atrocity. Misery loves company. And if you feel that things are fundamentally unjust and that the slings and arrows of being are aimed specifically at you, why should you treat anyone else with compassion or justice? Because things are fundamentally unfair. And even more deeply, why shouldn't you conclude that things should be eradicated because fundamentally they're unfair? Now, I think that's what Hitler concluded. I also think that's what Stalin concluded. The evidence suggests that Stalin was gearing up for the Third World War. I mean, he had hydrogen bombs. He'd already killed 30 million people. I mean, he had his practice trials. And there's an old psychoanalytic idea, and the idea is if you can't understand the motivations for the behavior, look at the outcome and infer the motivations. And so Hitler killed 100 million people if you include the whole Second World War, and God only knows how many Stalin killed, and Mao killed more than Stalin. Why? Well, their cover story was utopia, and I guess people believed that. Well, why? It didn't look very utopian when all those millions of people were dying. I think all those people who participated in those processes used their rational utopianism as a cover story for their willingness to participate in the atrocity. Because what they wanted to do was participate in the atrocity. They didn't give a damn about utopia. Then you ask yourself, well, how much do you try to force the world to behave according to your terms? The Catholics have always had trouble with rationality, and modern people, especially the sort of hyper-atheists that you hear from now and then, really don't like that because they believe that rationality is the highest virtue, and that's wrong. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say in a university, except maybe the university isn't here to teach you to be rational. Maybe it's here to teach you to be virtuous, and those aren't the same thing. And the rational person says, well, I understand, and having understood, I impose an order, and then I work to make that imposed order a reality. That's what every ideologue does. It's what every utopian does. It's convincing, and I think the reason that people do that is because it's complicated. Partly they want an explanation for their being, but more importantly than that, they want a mask that covers up their tendency to atrocity with the appearance of virtue. And most utopian thinking is of that sort, even though the mask can be very well argued. And you ask me why I believe that, and the reason I believe that is because we had 100 years of it, and that's how it turned out. One of the things that was terrible about living in the Soviet Union was that you couldn't suffer because things were perfect. So if you were suffering and you even admitted it, then you were instantly an enemy of the state. So if you're an ideologue, your own suffering makes you a heretic, right? You undermine your belief in your own bloody system by suffering. Well, and that's fine. If your belief has stopped you from suffering, well, more power to you. But if you're still suffering a bit, or a lot, or a tremendous amount, then you can ask yourself, maybe there's something I don't know. Here's an existential exercise. So, and this is not rational. You say, let's assume that virtue's worth pursuing. And I say it's worth pursuing because a virtuous path is the only path that justifies being to itself. That's the definition of virtue. A virtuous path justifies being to itself. Being is suffering. So you need a justification for your suffering. So then you might ask yourself, are there times in my life when I feel that my suffering is justified? And this is a good question. And you could ask yourself the reverse question too, which is, are there times in my life when my suffering is clearly not justified? And I could say, well, watch yourself for 3 weeks. Just watch, like you don't know anything. And see when you're somewhere that justifies itself. Now, you might say, well, how do I know? And I'd say, okay, well, here's some hints. You're not self-conscious. You know, it's not good to be self-conscious, right? It loads on neuroticism. It's a negative emotion. I mean, we think of it as a higher order cognitive function, but people find it unpleasant. You tend to be self-conscious when you're false or shamed. If you're deeply engaged in something, your self-consciousness disappears. So engagement in something meaningful seems to make self-consciousness vanish. It also makes time vanish, right? Because if you're doing something that is intrinsically meaningful, then the sense of passing time disappears. And so that temporal limitation that plagues you vanishes. And I could say, maybe you're having a miserable time of it and you only spend 2% of your waking hours in that condition. And maybe you don't even know when that is, but you could watch, you could see, and you could say, hey, look, wow, I spent 10 minutes there, I hardly even noticed, and I felt that the nature of my being justified itself. Well, maybe you wouldn't say that to yourself, but you could. You could say, that was worth it. And then I could say, well, practice that. Above all else. Forget about everything else. And then there's an alternative exercise. Pay attention and figure out when absolutely your being does not justify itself. That's even easier, you know, because that'll happen whenever you do something that you immediately regret or are ashamed of, or that, even more precisely, makes you feel disintegrated and devalued. Nietzsche said people betray themselves for the sake of their good name all the time. You can feel this. It seems to center in your solar plexus. When you say something or do something that is not virtuous, then you'll disintegrate and then you're weak, and you can feel that, and then you'll cover it up with a bunch of rattling arguments trying to convince yourself and other people that what you were doing was actually okay. But you know, and it's your rational arrogance and authoritarianism that forces you not to drop your stupid presuppositions and just pay attention to what your being is revealing to you. We don't think that way. We don't think being reveals things. It reveals things all the time. We just don't pay any attention. Why? Well, I think we don't want the responsibility. I really believe, I've thought about this for a long time, I really believe that that's the case. Here's a quote from the Tao Te Ching. I have a great translation of this book. It was written by Lao Tzu years and years ago. It's one of the world's classics of literature. The person who wrote this wasn't a philosopher. The person who wrote this was a master of being. That's a different thing, because a philosopher thinks, but a master of being doesn't think. Because thinking is a tool, and being is something that supersedes any tool. He said, it is by sheathing intellect's bright light that the sage remains at one with his own self, ceasing to be aware of it. By placing it behind, detached, he is unified with his external world. By being selfless, he is fulfilled. Thus his selfhood is assured. I show my students in my Maps of Meaning class Pinocchio. Pinocchio is a very complicated story. The Disney version and the previous version, it's got a deep mythological base. And one of the things that happens in Pinocchio, a lot of strange things happen that people just swallow, right? There's a puppet, it turns into a human being. There's talking cats, there's blue fairies, there's stars, there's whales that eat people, and everyone swallows that with no problem, right? You go to see Pinocchio, you don't even notice that a puppet has just gone into a whale and you know what the hell's going on. And the reason you don't notice that is because it means something and you don't know what it means, but you know that it means something and you're willing to ride on it, weirdly enough, because it compromises your rational principles completely. It does, it does. These are religious experiences that people have in movie theaters. They suspend disbelief. They go along with it. It's not rational, but they believe it. And if someone says, you know, they elbow you and say, that's not real, you say to them, maybe you could shut up so I could watch the movie. All right, you don't want their rationality because it's the wrong time for it, it's the wrong place for it. Geppetto wishes that his pet puppet could become real. It's a very unlikely wish, which is something he says, very unlikely. It's unlikely to happen. I think actually Jiminy Cricket says that. To have that happen, Geppetto has to wish on a star, which is a strange idea. The star is something that partakes of the divine, you could say that. If you look at the night sky, where you can really see it, you know that, right? You look at the night sky and infinity opens itself up before you and there's nothing to say except there's nothing to say. And to wish on a star is to put your eyes above the horizon and to pick a transcendent point and to wish for something, to want for something that's beyond the concrete and immediate. And to become virtuous and to not be a puppet is to aim at something transcendent. I could say, well, at least it's the absence of evil. That's something. Well, maybe it's even more than that. Maybe it's virtue in and of itself. There's a line in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very strange sermon, and the line is, take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient. I see that in resentful men all the time. They're very... It's a very strange piece of advice. It sounds completely impractical, right? I mean, limit the focus of your consciousness to the day and leave the worries alone. Well, it means something meditative, I think. You see the little cartoon of Robert Crumb off to the left there? With people, he's got a big Oedipal problem. Old Rob Crumb. And the problem with him, fundamentally, is his mother was sometimes, but I shouldn't. I don't necessarily know what their problem is or what they should do about it. But I can listen. And if I listen, and maybe I learned this in part from Carl Rogers' writings, if I listen, then thoughts will occur to me. I'm not thinking them. It's different. I'm letting the thoughts come up. And I tell my clients, try to tell me the truth, and I'll try to listen without being too much of a son of a bitch, and maybe, you know, maybe we can work something out. And then they'll say something to me, and maybe I'll think, well, that thing you said now and the thing you said half an hour ago don't seem to be coherent, so maybe you could straighten that out. Or, you know, it seems more like I'm tracking what they're saying, and when I'm listening to them, I'm in the same place they are. We know the neural mechanisms for that. You are in the same place with someone when you really listen to them. And then thoughts come up, and I tell them what they are, and it's impersonal. It's impersonal. Because I'm not trying to get them to do anything particularly. I'm just aiming maybe at helping them figure out what's going on and having a little bit less suffering. And it's not the imposition of an ideological structure. And the idea behind this particular piece of advice is, you can try this too. You wake up in the morning and you think, okay, this could be a good day, whatever that means. You don't know, right, what a good day is, but maybe you've had a couple and they're not so bad, and so maybe you think you could have another one, but you don't know, and you think, okay, you ask yourself, and this is meditative, what is it that I need to do today so that this would be a good day? And your brain will tell you, it'll say, you know that bill that's hiding under 5 pieces of paper on your desk? You should haul that sucker out and pay it. Or there's something you're avoiding that makes you anxious that your brain will pick on right away, and it'll say, you have to do these, whatever number of commitments today, and if you do them, then you've fulfilled your obligations. And the idea behind this piece of advice is that if you fulfill your obligations every day, then you don't have to worry about the future. And that's a very interesting idea. And it's predicated on the notion that there's a wisdom inside people that's deeper than mere rationality. And I believe that to be the case because we're far older than mere rationality. From an evolutionary perspective, from any perspective you want, we're deeper than rationality. And we know, psychologists have learned in the last 20 years, that rationality is bounded ridiculously in all sorts of different ways. It's not the master, it's a servant. And it's an unruly servant, even though it can be a very powerful one. The totality of you, the wisdom that's embodied in the totality of you, is far outstrips rationality. And if you listen to yourself and do the difficult things that yourself tells you to do, the idea is you don't have to compute the utopian future, because following what it is that you tell yourself to do every moment is the best path to whatever the best outcome is. It's a strange way of thinking, because if you're a utopian and a rationalist, you already know what the right outcome is. And then you have to run around pointing guns at people to make bloody sure that they do the right thing so that the outcome you've computed occurs. And that doesn't seem to work very well. And so you see this idea in Taoism too. The idea is to give up the end, because you don't know what it is, and you don't. It's an admission of ignorance. Where are you headed? You don't know. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be headed somewhere. Follow your moral intuitions. Stop doing the things that make you feel weak. I'm not talking about following a moral code, although that can come into it. If you really don't know what the hell you're doing at all, then following a moral code is a good idea, because it'll at least get the ball rolling. It's a form of apprenticeship. So, you know, not doing the obviously bad things is a form of discipline. It isn't the notion that I'm talking about now. This is a different thing. This is, pay attention to what's meaningful, because you can see what that is. You may find you're terrified of it, because everybody's got this little secret wish. I really love doing, I don't know what it is. It's different things for different people. But they're afraid to do it, to really do it, because as soon as you do what you really love, then you expose your nakedness, right? You say, this is what I'm really like. Instead, you just shove that under the bed and you do something you don't care about at all, and then if people judge you, it doesn't matter. But the problem with that is there's no life there. There's no force. There's no you. And without that, the suffering will do you in, and then you'll become a bad person. And that's not a good thing. So you have to see what it is that you find meaningful, whatever that is, and then you have to fight for it. You have to fight against yourself. You have to fight against other people, because what do they know about it? And you have to fight against nature, maybe even, to stand up for what it is that sustains you. And that takes courage. It also takes honesty. Partly because if you're not honest, you can't trust your own intuition. So this is an important thing. You think about this, and this is why virtue is a necessity. If you lie to yourself or to other people, then you corrupt the structure that you use to interact with being. You corrupt it. And if you corrupt it, then if you listen to it, it will guide you the wrong way. Or maybe it'll be so corrupted you can't listen to it at all. Then you have to listen to somebody else. And that might not be a good thing, especially if you're already corrupted. Because then you'll listen to the person who tells you to do what you really want to do, but won't admit it to yourself. And that explains how Hitler found all his followers. They'd abandoned their own mode of being. It made them bitter and resentful, and empty, and hollow, and weak, and cruel. And then they trained their leader to tell them what they wanted to hear. If you're honest, which is painful, you'll see that a lot of things you say aren't real. You'll see a lot of things that you do make you weak. You'll see that a lot of people you associate with are probably not good for you. And then you have a lot of difficult choices to make. You can stop with the obvious lying. That'll clear things up for you a lot. And you can start communicating with people. One of the things I teach my clients is if you're resentful, say something about it. Say something about it. You tell the person, look, what you asked me to do is making me resentful. Now, if they're your wife or husband or someone you love, you should listen to them, because they might say, well, grow up. Take your damn responsibility and leave me alone. And maybe they're right. Or maybe they're a bit of a bully, and you have to say, quit pushing me around. And then maybe you have to have an argument with them, an honest argument, where you say, look, this is what's happening to me. And they say, look, this is what's happening to me. And you battle it out until you reach some sort of settlement, and then you don't have to be resentful anymore. Then you won't be mean and cruel and vicious. And you have to be honest in order to do that. Here's a way of thinking about error. You don't exactly know what you're doing, so how do you get to the point where you know what you're doing? I think follow your internal intuitions and be honest about it. And then what will happen is a star will appear, and guide you. And the star is whatever makes your life meaningful. And maybe you'll take some tentative steps in that direction. And you'll get a little ways and you'll think, no, that's wrong. And then the thing that makes your life meaningful will appear over there, and then you take a few tentative steps in that direction. But as you step and walk towards these things, you change, and as you change, you get wiser. And what happens is if you keep following these things that make your life meaningful, then you correct yourself across time. You see the thing there and that's wrong, and you see it there and that's wrong, and you see it there and that's wrong, but you keep chasing it, and as you chase it, you move forward. And as you move forward and you do things and you learn from your mistakes because you're honest and you're watching, you get wiser and wiser, and the consequence of all those mistakes is you'll self-correct the mistakes, and 20 years down the road, maybe you won't be making so many mistakes. They say it takes 10,000 hours to be an expert at something. So you would need 10,000 hours of practice following what it is that you need to follow. I'm going to close with two things. I've come to the conclusion, as a consequence of studying the things I've been telling you about, that belief has a religious substructure. If you go all the way down into someone's belief structure, right to the bottom, what you find are religious presuppositions. The person might not agree, but I don't think that matters. I think generally people don't know. Here's an old religious presupposition. It's older than Christianity. I suppose Christianity is the most powerful proponent of this viewpoint. There's a heaven and there's a hell. And you should live your life so that you end up in one of them. What's happened to Christianity is that that's an afterlife thing. But I don't think it is an afterlife thing. I think it's a now thing. I see people who are in hell all the time. And you can see them if you walk down Bloor Street. I'm not kidding, it's no joke. If you walk by someone in hell, you can't look at them. You won't look at them. You'll give them a wide berth, and if you look at them, and you really look at them, they'll either become aggressive or ashamed, because they do not want you to see where they are, because they don't want to see where they are. And by the same token, heaven's a real place too, and now and then you're in it, but you don't notice because you don't believe in it. There was an old gospel, Gnostic gospel, that was dug up in 1957, the Gospel of Thomas, and in the Gospel of Thomas, Christ says, "The kingdom of heaven is spread out on the earth, but men do not see it." And I don't think that's a metaphor, or maybe it is a metaphor, it's a deep metaphor. It means that life, human life, is very expensive, and we live in the middle. It's kind of a mediocre middle often, and at one extreme there's hell, and the other extreme is heaven, and we bounce back and forth between them without really noticing. And I could say, well, here's something to consider. If the things you're doing are landing you in hell, stop, unless you want to be there. And you know, if you think, all you have to do is think about your life over the last year. You can be certain that you can call to mind times when you would have rather that did not happen. And so the lesson from that is clear. Don't set up those conditions anymore. And by the same token, if you watch yourself, you can tell when you're where you want to be. And I could say, well, if you're where you want to be, and that's really the right place, then all you should ever do is practice to be there. The kingdom of heaven is spread out on the earth, but men do not see it. So this is what I would say about virtue. Virtue, first, is the attempt to see that heaven. And it's a questioning thing. And I'm not saying it's the same for everyone. I don't believe that at all, because people are individuals. Just to see it. And the second thing is to attempt to live in it. And I truly believe that there is nothing that you can do that's better for being. Like, not only for yourself, but for everyone that you interact with. None of you know your potential. People are amazing creatures. You know that people can be abysmally awful. But they can be as remarkably good as they are abysmally awful. I think it's rare, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. What's a human possibility? Well, no one knows. Maybe it's near infinite. We know nothing about our own being or about our relationship with the totality of things. We may occupy a more important place than we all think. And the consequences of our actions, our virtues or our lack thereof, may echo far beyond what we want to believe. So I would say, try to find out what's good for you. Just watch. Don't listen to anybody else, or maybe you should. Maybe they'll give you some hints, you know. But you got to sort it out for yourself. And when you find out what's good for you and what isn't, do the things that are good for you until you like being alive, until you're thrilled to be alive. And see what happens. And I would also suggest there's nothing you could possibly do that will be more profound and useful than that. That's all. Thank you.
C56. Temperatura extremadamente alta, 0% agua. Planeta D.
Ramírez, ¿sigue con sus arbolitos?
Sí, vendo bonsáis.
Se siente el señor Miyagi. ¡Mi bonsai!
Vendobonsáis.com.
No piensa renunciar, ¿verdad?
Con GoDaddy, construir tu página web es muy fácil. Pruébala gratis.
Dr. Peterson's online self-help program, the Self-Authoring Suite, has been featured in the Oprah magazine, on CBC Radio, and on NPR's national website. It has helped over 150,000 people resolve the problems of their past and radically improve their future. Would you please welcome with me Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Thanks very much. So, today's theme is understanding, and so what we're going to try to do, building on the last talk, is to understand.
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more, is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality
Ben Shapiro enrolled
better for everyone.
at UCL.
I think, okay. You know, and I'm really delighted, you know, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No, because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, you know, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc. That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same.
No,
and it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. They don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well, and I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, I mean, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you know, you're leaving soon. It's
men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to address...
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
You know, I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Okay. You kept very quiet through this, Michael. I'm going to make you put you under a bit of pressure. Do forgive me, I'm going to come to the calls in a moment. Your boss called the gender pay gap a burning injustice. Is it?
Yes, it is, because there should be inequality of opportunity. There needs to be the same rights. But you know, something that surprised me, that neither of you, and the quality of outcome, sure, all of that. But the one thing both of you haven't mentioned is the biological difference, which unfortunately affects women's career prospects, whether we like it or not. Babies. And that does cause a problem. You know, if I were to take a sabbatical from a corporation for a while, it's going to set me back slightly. And it is a problem that biologically it's women who have babies, not men.
Sure, but that's why we are the Women's Equality Party is the only party in the UK that's got policies around shared parental leave.
She's so political.
We're the only party that has got fully costed plans for universal free childcare. What we're saying is that
you're trying to change the
we're trying to change the outcomes, and also men are joining our party. Men who are really
as I
tired.
said,
I'm sure I'm going to have a word with Michael because I am sure he'll want the application.
Okay.
Features and jobs are going to be more about mental skills.
Technology.
But then I've been visited schools and I work in STEM. I'm a software developer, and the number of women doing software development hasn't increased. I would have thought they would have increased more, but I went into secondary school to do GCSE IT stuff, and there's very, very few girls doing IT, and I was thinking IT is the future, and and the schools are pushing for more girls to go into IT, but there's only I visited about 8 schools.
Can I just, sorry, Celine, can I just note, because I'm 30 seconds, Sophie's idea, actually representations in the media could be affecting such choices. Geeks, we see geeks, bespectacled blokes with bad hair on computers. That's what tech means, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because I think actually that one of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about, nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break it all
on
down.
programmes like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion. Can I just say how wonderful 3 people, diverse political views, diverse views on many other issues, that get along famously and have wonderful conversations. Thank you. That is exactly the ambition that I have for this show. So Jordan, good luck with the book. It is out now. It's called 12 Rules for Life.
University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson has become a phenomenon. That's not an overstatement. Videos featuring him online get millions of views. His book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, is one of the biggest, maybe the biggest bestseller ever written by a Canadian author. In that book, Peterson questions the left's rhetoric on gender, and maybe for that, he's being targeted for destruction. The Guardian calls him dangerous. Vox just published a massive and almost unbelievably stupid piece accusing Peterson of, quote, reactionary politics that validate white, straight, and cisgender men at the expense of everyone else. Really mouth-breathingly stupid, but there you have it. Jordan Peterson joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on. So obviously a hurt dog barks. You've done something that has made people upset. What do you think you've said that the left finds so provocative and upsetting?
Well, I pointed out quite clearly why they're factually incorrect and ideologically possessed. I mean, is particularly on issues like gender. The radical lefties insist that gender is a social construct, and that's just simply not true. So the scientific data on that are absolutely crystal clear, and no reasonable scientist disagrees. And so they're all foaming at the mouth because I'm poking holes in their cherished notions. And they like to think that people are completely malleable because that means people can be made over in their ideological image. So they're not happy about that.
So when they say your ideas are dangerous, what they're really saying is your ideas are dangerous to them.
I hope so. They're supposed to be dangerous to them. I make no bones about that. I'm not a fan of radical leftists. And look at what happened in the 20th century with radical leftist ideology.
What has your job been like back in academia? I mean, you can't be one of many people who has these views where you live and work.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I think they're more common than you think. I mean, my views on gender, for example, and sex, they're shared widely among people in the psychometric personality community. Anybody who studies personality and who's a credible scientist knows full well that the differences between men and women in personality are to be attributed primarily to biological factors. This isn't contentious. The only people it's contentious around are gender ideologues, and they've already lost the scientific battle, and so they've taken it to the legislative front to enforce their views. So they're really not contentious viewpoints. They're mainstream science, and I'm criticized all the time for spouting pseudoscience. It's like, it's not pseudoscience, it's mainstream science. and people who know the literature aren't disputing this. It's been known at least since the 1990s.
Well, then why are people whose views are not rooted in science, but instead in emotion and superstition, dominating our public conversation and punishing anyone who doesn't disagree? How did they get so much power?
Look, I actually think there's a technical reason for that, is that, it's obvious that things can go too far on the right and they can go too far on the left. And it's kind of easy to put a box around people who go too far on the right. You can just look at claims of racial superiority.
Right.
But it's not so easy to put a box around people who go too far on the left. There's not a single thing you can point to that they do that has the same sort of red flag nature as claims of racial superiority. So it's hard for people who are left-leaning, say, and concerned with inequality and that sort of thing, to dissociate themselves from those who have clearly gone too far. And the problem is we really don't know where the red flags are in leftist territory. Now, for me, it's equality of outcome is a good, so-called equity. That's a red flag, but it doesn't seem as immediately pathological as, say, claims of racial superiority. So it's harder for people on the left to dissociate themselves from the people who would do everyone in, essentially.
So you drew the line at pretending that biological sex isn't real. I mean, that's how you first became famous, because you said, I'm not going to lie about science. Well, do you think it's a good place for the rest of us to start?
Well, I think it's a reasonable place. I mean, the Canadian government built a social constructionist view of gender into the law, and that's just incorrect. I mean, the idea that biological sex, gender expression, gender identity, and sexual preference have no relationship to one another, that they vary independently, that there's almost nothing you could claim that's more false than that. But now it's been written into the law. Well, it's just patently absurd, and it's actually a telling commentary on the state of political discourse across the West, that something like that could even happen.
Yeah.
But I think it's equality of outcome that's the real pathological desire. That's a bad one.
I agree. But, I mean, I guess the good news is that taking a stand on behalf of obvious truths, there's a huge audience for it, and you're a living testament to that. Thank you, Professor. Good to see you.
No, good to see you, too. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right.
No, I know we're in Manhattan, but this is Scandinavia in Manhattan.
I can tell because the audience is so attractive.
Oh, yeah, and I guess you can smell all the liberals as well. So it's...
Yes, but as long as they're good-looking, who cares?
Tell me, why do you think it's so hard for this show? Because we really tried hard to find someone that can explain Trump as a phenomenon from the other side, from the right side. And it's been very hard for a Scandinavian show in New York to get someone on.
It's very hard to find someone in America who can explain Donald Trump to you. I'm not surprised there is confusion. I think it's because most of Trump's supporters aren't people like me who go on TV. They're out in America. They're roofers and farmers and gas station attendants and they're doctors. I mean, there are a lot of New Yorkers who love him, but wow, not the commentary class, not the people who go on TV.
When did you realize that Donald Trump was your guy?
If we're in the laboratory designing my ideal presidential candidate, I don't think in a million years I would have come up with Donald Trump. But I give a lot of speeches in America. That's mostly what I do. I write. I mean, everything else I do free. The only ways I make money is by writing books and giving speeches. And I noticed, oh my gosh, immigration is a big issue. And in Washington, D.C., they do not care. They absolutely will not listen to the voters. It was all about immigration. So when Trump came down the escalator and gave what I fondly refer to as the Mexican rapist speech, he had just read my book, Adios America.
So
hoping they would read it.
In a way, it was inspired by you.
Much of it, I mean, is the footnotes to, he had the right instincts. He definitely had the right instincts, but there was the book. And he saw me, actually before the book came out, talking about it with Jorge Ramos and asked for an advance copy of it. He has a sense for what the public wants.
How well do you know him?
Well, not very well. I mean, I grew up in Connecticut. So Trump he was just always something that was there. He was like the Empire State Building.
But do you know him personally?
I'd met him. He was never really, he's not a very Connecticut type person. We kind of look down on people who brag about their wealth. So he wasn't exactly, in terms of style, my cup of tea. But I overcame that because he's giving me the issues I care about. And then there comes a moment, I mean, I advised him a little bit during the campaign. I showed up at Mar-a-Lago one night. It was after you, I hope you don't know about this, but there was a moment during one of the debates when he was, not obviously, but obviously, bragging about his penis size. So I showed up at Mar-a-Lago. It's just him, Hope Hicks, Corey Lewandowski. The whole campaign was 3 people, those 3 people. I show up, they're eating dinner, they're exhausted, and I said to him, look, I'm the only person losing money trying to put you in the White House. You are going to listen to me. No more bragging about your penis size. And he said...
Just to have that problem with a candidate.
It was very unusual. Yes, I admit that.
Let's face it, on the other side of politics, and also many Republicans, they are not happy with him.
Oh, no, they're not happy at all.
What do you think is the main problem?
What Trump exposed, I'm not sure if it's like this. I never hated the Republican Party so much, and I realized both politicians, it really isn't. I stopped seeing the country in terms of Republican, Democrat. It's both parties against the people. And they lie to us when they're running for office, and the political consultants take millions of dollars to tell them what to say and to formulate these arguments. And the political consultants, at least for Republicans, kept losing and losing and losing. And here comes Donald Trump without a pollster, without a political consultant, with a somewhat abrasive manner and unusual background, and all he has to do is give the people what they're asking for.
But wait, unusual background, yes, but he's not a man of the people.
Weirdly, he is.
Well, that could be debated.
I mean, okay, he lives on Fifth Avenue. He's on his 3rd marriage. He's married to a model. He's in Trump Tower. Okay, he's not your average American, but the issues were all the issues. I mean, people, the few people in the media, and I'm friends with a lot of journalists, and they used to say, if you left New York or Washington, you get 60 miles outside of one of the major coastal cities, and you couldn't go 10 miles without seeing a huge barn with Trump painted on the side.
I've also read that you claim that people on the liberal side, they don't have a sense of humor.
Well, it's a strategy with the left in this country deployed like you've never seen before with Trump, where they pretend not to get jokes. I mean, like when Trump said, I remember I was listening to that line about Russia, if you're listening, if you could find those 30,000 emails of Hillary Clinton's. I was packing at the time, just listening to him give the speech loud. I'm by myself in my bedroom, and I burst out laughing. And then I see all these grim reporters. He's signaling to Vladimir Putin. Oh, come on. When an audience laughs, it's a joke.
So in your ears, that's a joke?
In the entire audience's ears. I mean, they do the same thing to me. I tell a joke, they, translate it into German and then put it through a computer and bring it back and take the humor out.
So how do you see what you call political correctness? Do you think it's impossible to be politically correct and have a sense of humor at the same time?
I think it's very hard, and I think most comedians would tell you that. I spend a lot of time with comedians in New York and in LA, and it's driving them. I mean, but why do they like me? Most of them are liberals, but the things I get attacked for are the things they get attacked for. No, a joke is a joke, and I'll defend jokes that totally go against my side. Alec Baldwin had a famous one a few years ago. I totally defend him.
So did you like his parody of Trump?
Yes, I think he's... I actually think it's pretty funny, but I think it would be funnier. I mean, this is a fine point. Nobody cares about this, but it's hard to do a funny imitation of someone when you're driven by hate.
Did you have, like when you grew up, did you have negative experience with
liberals?
with liberals or with immigrants? For that
yes, I still have nightmares. No, I love immigrants. I have lots of immigrant friends. They stay at my house. I cook them dinner. The point is, even the ones no, I want to protect the ones who are already here and the Americans already here. And we have taken, and I know in Sweden it gets talked about a lot. You guys aren't close to what's happened to America. This has been 50 years of bringing in third world immigrants, and whose wages are they driving down? They're driving down the poorest Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans. They're just trying to get a foothold. Their wages have been flat. In California, they're negative.
You call them rapists and criminals, and this is the way of characterizing people that is...
No, my argument is that we are bringing in cultures that not only, I mean, they're very, it's very bad for the people already here and the least fortunate among us. I mean, I don't work at Wendy's. I'm not a roofer. My wages aren't being driven down, but I care about my fellow Americans, including my fellow immigrant Americans. And I think government policy ought to be to serve the Americans already here. What both political parties care about isn't serving their voters. It's serving their donors. And their donors want the cheap labor. So that's what has been going on for 50 years.
Are you a feminist?
Oh, gosh, no. Oh, sorry.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, I don't know what it means in Europe, but in this country it tends to mean, well, an angry, man-hating lesbian.
Well, it doesn't, does it?
It does!
The fact that you have the right to vote, do you appreciate that?
I don't think you want to push me on that one.
But tell me, really, because it's
one
interesting.
of my more outre views.
but okay.
Now let's move on from women's right to vote. I think it was a rash experiment. I'm not sure it's worked out.
This is interesting.
So I think women should be armed, and I think they should be allowed to run for office and talk about politics and write books about politics. And don't worry, we're not repealing the 19th Amendment.
This is very interesting. You talk about a resistance. Your book is called Resistance.
Right.
But who is the resistance?
Well, it's mostly the media, heavily the media, and the political class. I mean, one of the things Trump did that was very clever is to identify the swamp. It's, you know, I forget who said it, but people can't understand things until there's a word for it. Now there is a word for the swamp, and oh my gosh, is Trump right? And I never realized it before. The swamp has its own interest. That is Washington, D.C., and where they have the highest incomes in the country and the highest incomes in all of the counties. No, you're working for government. You have steady employment. You can't be fired. You have great health care. You're not supposed to be being paid more than the average American, but they are. And so the swamp is, they can't stand Trump because he humiliated them.
You want to end mainstream media, right?
Oh, I'm hoping Trump does. I think that's the one thing we may get out of it.
Yeah, so the freedom of speech. What happened?
No. I believe in freedom of speech. They don't.
But you talk about a chemotherapy. You have to remove it like a cancer.
I don't think you're giving the fullness of the quote. My final chapter is the one thing we might get out of Trump is that he could destroy the media, that he could be like chemotherapy for the country. You know, it's terrible to go through. You vomit, you lose your hair, but in the end, it kills the cancer cells. So with Trump, you vomit, you lose your hair, but the entire New York Times editorial board dies. Oh, yay. So then it can be rebuilt on more ethical lines.
He's a click machine. He has done, he's really done a lot for the media.
No kidding.
He made the media a lot better.
Every day.
You've really been supporting him through a lot, let's say that. And also...
He doesn't think so.
No, but now he doesn't think so anymore because you're disappointed.
Right.
But the difference between you and many liberals is that you're disappointed he doesn't go far enough.
Build the wall, end these job-killing trade deals, pull our troops back from Afghanistan.
Because you really want that wall, right?
Well, it's not like it's, just something I thought up. Every rally for 18 months, that was the chant.
Yeah, and you still want it.
Yes, I think it's going to be a blowout against him if he doesn't build it.
I think to many Europeans and Scandinavians, your thoughts are a bit foreign. Some would disagree strongly. I think on your views on especially on Mexican people and immigrants in general. But
if I can say one more thing about the immigrant point. I feel like I'm the only one who actually really wants diversity. If all we're going to have is this constant churning and constant
immigration, but isn't that because of immigration that we have that?
We're all going to look alike. There will be no difference. There will be no culture. I want to go to Sweden and and eat fish and have it be light all night.
You wouldn't last 5 minutes in Sweden, I'm afraid.
Buy IKEA furniture and listen to ABBA. And then I want to go to Italy and have pasta. I mean, I think it works better if cultures stay in their own countries, so you have genuine diversity as opposed to just one bland.
Well, but don't say
America
is all about immigration, isn't it?
No, but don't say you're for diversity. You're for ending culture, actually.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you are.
No, I didn't say that.
Well, if you want if you want everyone to be the same and all cultures to be alike, and for there to be no difference, I could wake up and not know if I'm in Mexico, Syria, Egypt, Sweden, Italy.
Isn't this country all about immigration?
No. That's an invention.
Is it?
Yeah, it's about freedom. It's about that one really successful British colony, although Canada and Australia aren't bad, not as good as America.
Ann Coulter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the clip. There would come a time when people would not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. How is today's identity politics consistent with that vision?
Jordan Peterson.
Well, I don't think it's consistent with that vision at all. I mean, the problem I have with identity politics as a mode of philosophical apprehension is that it's predicated on the idea that the appropriate way to classify people is by their group identity, in whatever fragmentary formulation that might take, in the multiplicity of ways that people can be divided into groups. And the classical postmodern, and I would also say Marxist way of viewing the world, even though those two things shouldn't be allowed together, they tend to be, is that group identity takes priority over individual identity, and I think that's precisely the opposite of what Martin Luther King was hoping for and working for. And I think it's unbelievably dangerous, partly because when you assume that people should primarily be identified by their group, then you can also attribute group guilt to them by their group. And then things go downhill very, very rapidly. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that sort of thing happening, say, throughout the 20th century.
Are there particular groups that you are more concerned about than others? For example, the Liberal Party, as Terry Butler said earlier, is a group. Are there groups that you think are more dangerous?
There isn't a problem with groups. The problem is with assuming that the fundamental way that you should categorize people is with their group identity. Obviously, we all belong to groups. The issue is whether or not the individual identity is primary and the group identity is secondary, or the group identity is primary and the individual identity is secondary. If you're a proponent, for example, of equality of outcome, of quotas, then you de facto accept the proposition that it's the group identity that is primary, and there's all sorts of dangers that are associated with that far outweigh whatever good you're likely to do.
Okay,
well, maybe you're just...
Go ahead.
Or maybe you just think that representative democracy should be representative. Maybe you just think that women should be equally represented in the decision-making fora of our nation. Maybe that's really just about having proper equality in a body that's meant to be representative.
Well, I do believe that women should have... I don't understand your question, I guess.
I guess you don't. That's pretty obvious, unfortunately.
Well, how about if you phrase it more clearly, instead of just insulting me? Look at it this way. Let's talk about quotas for a minute. So there's a very wide array of jobs that are fundamentally done by men. So, for example,
Member of Parliament,
99.9% of bricklayers...
I'm going to stop sledging you now, I promise.
I'm happy to give my minute to Jordan.
99.9% of bricklayers are men. Should we have quotas for women?
Is bricklaying representative democracy?
That has nothing to do with the question. The question is if there's evidence of structural inequality and oppression because women aren't precisely represented at 50% in all professions at all levels, then why don't we have a conversation about having women represented in all professions at all levels. Why do we talk about the C-suite, for example? Why do we talk about politics and positions of power? Why don't we talk about it across the board?
Okay, so let's just pause and...
yeah, but that's because it's power.
You pose a question to Terry Butler. Go ahead and answer it, then we'll hear from the other panellists.
His question to me.
Well, yeah, if you'd,
about
like,
bricklayers.
if you'd like to answer the question about bricklayers.
There's nothing wrong with bricklayers.
Why there are no quotas in bricklayers.
Of course there's not.
The left or the right.
Chris is an ex-vicar. I'm an ex-Trotskyist. And when I was a Trotskyist, of course, I had no morals at all, which was the whole point of it, that you set out to do what you thought was right at the expense of anybody or anything that got in your way. And had I ever been in a position to do it, I would have done terrible things to my opponents on those grounds, because I believed so profoundly that I was right. And one of the reasons why I am now, oddly enough, in the same church as Chris Bryant is because I decided to put a stop to all that. I didn't think it was legitimate anymore to believe so strongly that I was right, that I could even think of treating people as I would have done had I successfully achieved the Bolshevik Revolution, which I sought so actively in the 1960s and 1970s. So morality in politics seems to me to be dangerous. The other thing about morality is it seems to me to be increasingly, as I get older and nearer to being dead, that it seems to me to be very much about yourself and not about other people. The best definition of morality I ever came across was morality is what you do when you think nobody is looking. And people sometimes get quite shocked when I say that, but it seems to me an honest appreciation of what it's about. What politicians can do about morality is they can quite often push people into doing things they don't want to do, because they, the politicians, think those things are right, or they can stop people from doing things that they would otherwise like to do. And my great beef about this is that over the past 50 or 60 years, almost every piece of legislation, social or economic, has been designed to make it harder for people, unless they're very rich, to raise their own children, and particularly for women to stay at home and bring up the next generation rather than going out and being wage slaves. I will say one other thing, that the left over that period have tended to take the view that simply by holding the opinions they have and being on the side of what they term progress, they are themselves moral, and that those who don't hold their views, which I don't, are themselves immoral. So I take, for example, the fact that I happen to think that capital punishment is sometimes justified in the case of heinous murder. Now, you can argue about this with me and you can disagree with me about it, and I will happily take you on, but the reaction of most self-described civilized persons in London to any suggestion of that kind is to recoil like a salted snail from me as a person, because I am so evil that I hold this view. And this seems to me to be a major problem in public discourse. You cannot really debate against anybody who despises you. And I find that it's very difficult a lot of the time to actually hold debates, because very rapidly the rules of reason and logic and the presentation of fact in support of argument flies out of the window, and it becomes about who and what you are. And that seems to me to be a major problem with almost all modern political discourse. The left think they're right, and not merely that, they think they're better people.
Fora TV, the world is thinking.
I want to talk about Islam for a moment, because I think we are wise to be concerned about it. As you know, I'm concerned about religion in general, but I think we're wise to differentiate specific religious beliefs. And we are, I think, quite encumbered by political correctness and just frank confusion on this front. One problem is that we have this one-word religion, which names this truly diverse spectrum of fascinations and ideological commitments. And religion is a nearly useless term. It's a term like sports. Now, there are sports like badminton, and there are sports like Thai boxing. Okay, and they have almost nothing in common apart from breathing. Now, there are sports that are just synonymous with the risk of physical injury or even death. I mean, there's sports that are just synonymous with violence. Now, if you get injured playing badminton, you're just embarrassed. We're facing a problem at this moment. There is, I'm happy to say, a religion of peace in this world, but it's not Islam. Okay. To call Islam a religion of peace, as we hear ceaselessly reiterated, is completely delusional. Now, Jainism actually is a religion of peace. Jainism is the core principle of Jainism is nonviolence. Gandhi got his nonviolence from the Jains. The crazier you get as a Jain, the less we have to worry about you. It is. This is. I mean, Jain extremists are actually they are paralyzed by their pacifism. Jain extremists they can't take their eyes off the ground when they walk lest they step on an ant. They filter every sip of water through cheesecloth lest they swallow and thereby kill a bug. I mean, needless to say, they're vegetarian. So the problem, notice, the problem is not religious extremism, okay, because extremism is not a problem if your core beliefs are truly nonviolent. The problem isn't fundamentalism, which we often hear this said. These are euphemisms. I mean, the only problem with Islamic fundamentalism are the fundamentals of Islam. Now, we have Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. These guys agree about the nature of reality and how to live within it. And the problem is they are giving a very plausible version of the faith. Osama bin Laden is not the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world. It would be wonderful if he were, but the problem is he is giving a truly straightforward version of Islam, and you really have to be an acrobat to figure out how he's distorting the faith. Now, if these guys were Jains or Buddhists or Amish or Quakers, it would be patently obvious how they were distorting their religion. I mean, in fact, their behavior would be unintelligible. Okay, it is not obvious by the light of Islam, and this is just a fact we have to speak honestly about. And no one should be speaking more honestly about this and more volubly about this than moderate Muslims. Moderate Muslims have to find some way to grapple with this fact. But to say that Osama bin Laden is David Koresh is just a lie, and it's a dangerous lie at this point.
Radical Islam as racist or xenophobic. But my next guest knows this issue from both sides. He is the first former Muslim to be president of a Christian university, Truett McConnell University in Georgia. I had the incredible privilege of speaking at Truett McConnell University earlier this year, and I met this college president and heard his riveting story, and I met his wife, who has her own incredibly timely story that we're going to hear about tonight. But for now, I want you to welcome the co-author of Unveiling Islam and the president of Truett McConnell University, Dr. Amir Kanner. It is an honor to have you with me. When I first met you, I just was stunned by your story. You grew up in a Muslim home. What was that like, growing up in a Muslim home here in America?
Well, we immigrated here to the United States. My father's Turkish, mother's Swedish, wife's Czech. And when we immigrated here, it was 1960s. It was the pioneer of Islam. There was only 100 mosques in 1960. Now, of course, more than 2,000. And so my father was one of the pioneers of the mosque there in Columbus, Ohio, where we were raised. And we're devout in our faith. And he taught us how to be devout Muslim boys. All 3 boys. Myself, I'm the youngest, and 2 older ones are both born overseas. And I'm glad to tell you today, all are born-again Christians and know the Lord Jesus Christ.
So that must have been a shock to the family system. When did you become a believer in Jesus?
There was a student that just wouldn't give up on me, invited me to every little event a Southern Baptist church had up in Columbus, Ohio, things I'd never heard of before, invited me to a lock-in. I'd never heard of a lock-in. It is in the Bible. If you look under the word hell, you will find a lock-in somewhere there.
There's a lot of youth pastors out there that are right now saying, boy, that's right.
But it was a revival service. Remember when Methodists and Baptists and others had revival service, and I just went on a Thursday night. For the first time in my life, I got to hear about the Lord Jesus Christ and his grace for me.
How old were you when that happened?
I was in middle school. Both my brothers were in high school, and we were saved. All 3 of us, all 3 Muslim boys within a year of each other.
How did your family react to that? Were they just...
Not good. Now, my mother, who had converted to Islam when she married my father, she had become disgruntled with faith. So to her, she wasn't excited or displeased at all. But my father, of course, did not take it well and disowned all of us.
We have recently seen several congressmen, particularly Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, both of whom are Muslim. And you know, I don't have a problem if people choose to be Muslim. I do have a problem with people who are anti-Semitic. I have a problem with Congresswoman Omar, who believes in the boycott, divestiture, and sanction movement against Israel. And the hideous comments she has made, including about 9/11, she said, some people did some things. I want you to help me understand, does that come from where she thinks and believes? How could she say those things and not understand why Americans are highly offended by that?
Yeah, you know, this all started in the 60s when we started coming, but it really birthed with Keith Ellison becoming a congressman out of Minnesota in 2006. And what did he do? He took the oath on the Quran. And when I was asked, well, does that offend you as a Christian? I said, no, it offends me as an American. You can't put your hand on the Quran and support democracy. It's not possible. The Quran is a theocratic book and a theocratic political book. And you see that, and you see your recognition that the more literal you take the Quran, the more likely you are to become militant and have these type of BDS views and speak about how you're hypnotized by Israel and so forth. It comes from verses of the Quran, like chapter 5, do not take a Jew or a Christian as your friend or protector, or you become like them.
But what we're seeing is an increased level of a radical mindset, that it's an all or nothing. Does that shock or surprise you in any way?
It doesn't. You know, when you look, you have to look at who's building the mosques and who's coming over. And when you see refugees from Somalia, which is a more strident country, when you see that the majority of mosques are funded by Saudi money or money such as that, then it's not going to be surprising that Saudi theology is the greatest export out of Saudi Arabia, not oil.
You had to worry that writing a book called Unveiling Islam was going to be controversial and would bring an enormous level of scorn upon you, but you did it anyway. I mean, what was it that said, I don't care what the risks are, I need to tell this story?
Yeah, you know, after 9/11, I think some of that spurred it from our spirit. My brother and I wrote it together and finished up pretty quickly. We just wanted to educate, in particular, Christians on to do 2 things: how to understand Islam, but also how to win Muslims to Jesus. Because the crucial aspect to all of this is still John 3:16, that God so loved the world, that includes today 1.8 billion Muslims. And I still have, of course, Muslims on my side of the family, and I would love for a Christian to share the love of the Lord Jesus Christ with them.
And I think that's a powerful part of your book, is that you're not being condemning, you're trying to be redemptive. You're hoping to say, if you're a Christian, you really love people, love Muslims, but love them in a way that may help them to come to Christ, as you have experienced in your life. Before I let you go, I got to tell you, the college, the university, Truett McConnell University that you lead, is an amazing place. It's quadrupled in size and enrollment since you've been there. You now have a number of graduate degrees. It's an extraordinary place. What I was most impressed by when I was on the campus, you don't mind being a biblical oriented university. You make no apologies for that. Why is that so important?
Well, there are a lot of schools that call themselves Christian, but the words are one thing, the actions are another. And I would rather train 300 warriors and 3,000 wimps. And the joy our faculty get to see and what we get to see is we get to raise up a generation of believers who love the Lord Jesus Christ. Every student has to take a Great Commission minor, which means a set of theology classes and mission trips and so forth that they have to take. That's a joy, because when they graduate, they are going to be the best business person, they're going to be the best missionary, but our key is we want them to be the best witness for the Lord Jesus Christ that they can possibly be.
It is a refreshing atmosphere. If people are not familiar with Truett McConnell University, I hope they get familiar. And by the way, let me say, you can get your copy of Unveiling Islam, the very book that Dr. Kanna wrote, along with other of his books. You can get them on Amazon. I really think this is an important book, and everyone who loves this country ought to read it and find out the philosophical underpinning of Islam and what it really is about. And if you're looking for an exceptional university for your kids, I'm going to tell you, I'd check out Truett McConnell University.
Is Islam more violent than any other faith?
I believe there are certain areas in Islam that needs to be reinterpreted. Otherwise, you will face violence at the end. Other religions have probably some texts that may lead to violence if you understood it literally. However, many of these religions have reformed already. Islam has not reformed yet. And the same anachronistic, old-fashioned ways of teaching are still today valid. And
is that a yes or a no? Is it more violent?
I believe with the literal understanding of it and with its history as written in Sharia books, today it is more violent.
Tom Fuentes.
Yes, it must be. Otherwise, how could all these groups take the name of Islam to become violent and do what they do? They're the ones that call themselves Islamists. They're the ones, you know, ISIS calling themselves the Islamic State. We didn't pin that name on them. We didn't say you're the non-Christian, you're the non-Jewish, the non-Buddhist, the non-Hindu, the non-Sikh. They said we're the Islamic State. So they're interpreting the teachings of the Prophet, the teachings of the Quran, and they're twisting it. They're putting it on it. But the fundamental basis is that they're calling themselves Islam and then cutting people's heads off.
Go ahead, Mr.
Wait,
Iftikhar.
Don. First of all, I find it absolutely astounding that a former assistant director of the FBI would say that Islam is a more violent religion than most other religions. If you look at the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony, that was made famous in the Kony 2012 campaign, that is a Christianist organization. You look at Christian extremist organizations here in the United States that have bombed gay nightclubs and abortion clinics in the name of Christendom. But every mainstream Christian knows that these are completely outside of any normative understanding.
But by saying, let me jump in. By saying that Islam is more violent than any other religion, it doesn't mean that other religions aren't violent. We're talking about history and the reality here. If you're looking at the bombing of abortion clinics, you're not looking at the numbers of a 9/11. You're not looking at the numbers of a Boko Haram. You're not looking at the many people who are killed from ISIS and beheaded. People don't go into abortion clinics. Yes, death is death, but people don't go into abortion clinics and behead people.
Don, what he's saying is true, Don.
Go ahead, Tom.
What he's saying is basically true. There was this level of violence in the other religions. The ancient Israelites did similar things in towns and killed everybody, men, women, and children in a town thousands of years ago. The Catholics, you know, there were Catholic priests that accompanied the conquistadors on the ships back in the day when they landed in Mexico and landed in South America. And they committed the Spanish Inquisition. That's what I'm trying to say. So major religions have had that period of time where they were as violent and frankly as horrible as could be to try to convert people to their teachings. And if they didn't get converted by hearts and flowers, they were killed or convinced by persuasion and violence to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, in the modern era, here and now, those other religions have kind of moved on past that being their normal method of operating to convert people to believe their belief. These people like ISIS, al-Baghdadi, is basically saying to moderate Sunnis, any Shia, any Yazidi, any Christian, anybody, I'm going to kill all of you. You need to convert to believe what we believe or we're going to kill you.
You're going to take what one knucklehead says out of 1.6 billion of us. I mean, if you look at the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh's co-conspirator Terry Nichols was a self-professed member of the Christian Identity Movement, which Syracuse University has found has over 250,000 followers here in the United States. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing that people are going to be so reductive and take isolated fringe extremists and extrapolate that to a religion of over 1 billion people. I mean, this goes into the whole narrative.
You're saying that these groups are so isolated?
Listen, Tom.
On every
President George W. Bush, after 9/11, said that the United States is not at war with Islam. President Barack Obama has said the same thing. But everything that is being said tonight feeds directly into this clash of civilizations mantra, where it's the West against Islam. And, for the 7 million American Muslims that live in the United States today, myself included, you tend to forget that 3 out of the last 10 Nobel Peace Prize winners were Muslims.
Welcome back to our show. Dr. Kanner is hanging around because my next guest is his wife. Now, this may just be America's ultimate power couple, because each has absolutely spellbinding stories of living firsthand in two of the most significant systems of our world today. Just as he unveils the truth about radical Islam, she warns students of the dangers of socialism in America, because she lived it growing up in Soviet-era Czechoslovakia. Please welcome Hannah Kanner. Hannah, thank you for coming.
Thank you for letting me be here.
Several months ago, I met you and we sat and visited, and I was riveted by the story that you experienced as a young girl growing up under the Soviet-dominated Czechoslovakia of your family's life. What was life like under communism?
Well, I would start off that I was always a perfect child because I was a pastor's child. I was lucky that my father was a pastor, my grandfather, my uncle was a pastor. So all was wonderful. So I heard the gospel ever since I was little. But growing up under communism as a Christian has its challenges. Since you're born, they start a file when they write enemy of the state, enemy of the regime. So when I was 14 years old, I had to have a mandatory meeting with our principal of the school, and he asked me, Hannah, what would you like to do when you grow up? And I said, I would love to be a teacher. And he looked at my file and he said, that's not gonna happen. And I was like, okay, can I be a nurse? Not gonna happen. And I looked at him and I said, what can I be? And he said, Hannah, you need to understand one thing. Because you're a Christian, you're the enemy of the state, therefore, we cannot have you anywhere you can have influence or other people, where you can share the gospel. So your future is going to be working in a shoe factory with deaf people, so you cannot share the gospel.
That is unbelievable. Did you ever experience, or did members of your family experience physical or intense kind of repercussions for being Christian?
My father, because he was a pastor, anytime he would be preaching, he told me, and this is not maybe like 6 years ago, he said that he would have the secret police, KGB, would come and listen up on his sermons to make sure he didn't say anything anti-government. And if he had any kind of guest speak there in English, he would have to go to special interrogations, and he never told me about it, and he would always say, I just have to run the errands. And he finally opened up and he said, Hannah, you don't understand. It was not physical abuse, but emotional. They would be yelling at me, threatening me with taking our family away, with not giving him any money to support our family. So it was lots of emotional abuse.
Recent studies have shown that over 50% of younger Americans think socialism would be terrific. What would you say to those people? Because you lived under it firsthand.
The truth is, socialism is anti-country, destroys country, it's anti-freedom. So if you want a taste of socialism, be ready for communism to step in, because those two are hand in hand right there. And it is very dangerous. And I say to the wonderful AOC squad members, you know what? I would love for her to go and live in socialism for 2 weeks and see how she does when
she does. 2 weeks.
Just 2 weeks. And I say you need to understand one thing. Once government starts telling you what you can or cannot do, you're going to completely lose what America is standing for, which is government for of the people, right? It's you as Americans have a right to say something. Well, not anymore. Because, you know, you're not allowed to have your opinion because immediately you're a racist or something else.
Hannah, you became an American citizen. There are a lot of people who say, well, you know, America's not a very good country, but you wanted to be a citizen. What makes America a place you wanted to be a part of?
Freedom. To me, America was always symbol of democracy, symbol of freedom, symbol of being able to say what I think, like religious liberty, all these are precious things, and I don't think people realize how precious they are until they're taken away.
Thank you. I just love you both. It's a delight to have you here. My thanks to Hannah Kanner. And if you want to dialogue with Hannah about the danger of socialism and the power of Christian faith, her email address is on the screen, so you can get in touch. And if you're looking for a university, as I said, that'll educate your kids instead of indoctrinate them with socialism, I hope you'll learn more about Truett McConnell at truett.edu.
The mother of a 7th grader is outraged after she says her daughter got a classroom assignment she says exposes how the school favors the left. Here's part of what that assignment said. Kevin is an optimist, a liberal, and believes government can help people help themselves, while Amos is pessimistic, a conservative, and believes government support makes people lazy. The concerned parent, her name is Sally Phillips, and she joins us now with more. Thanks for joining us, Sally.
Thank you.
So this school district, you live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Your daughter goes to Carmel Middle School. How did you find out about it? Your daughter comes home and says what to you?
She said, Mom and Dad, we had an assignment today I want to bring to your attention. It made me feel really bad, and I want you to see this.
Wow.
And we read it, and we were both shocked at what we read.
Why were you shocked?
We were shocked because of our conservative beliefs. It portrayed conservatives as negative, and if it was reversed and the liberal was, viewed as a negative pessimist, then I'm sure it would be on every news outlet.
All right, so
in the school system.
Did you talk to the teacher about it?
We have a meeting today with the principal and the teacher.
And what was the reaction? How did you get that meeting when you called the school? What did they say?
I emailed the principal, and he emailed right back, and we do have the appointment today at 1.
Okay, we did get a statement from the school. It says this content was not approved by Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools for inclusion in the curriculum or in teaching resources and has been removed from use. So why did you decide to speak out? Because a lot of parents would think, I don't want to say anything, I don't agree, I don't want to say anything because I don't want retaliation against my child. So why did you decide it was important for you to come on Fox this morning?
I think it's important to speak out when you become aware of the content of your curriculum at your school like this. We are outraged. We cannot believe that this is a critical thinking assignment, and it's really not critical thinking. It's insidious indoctrination of our child. And I'm speaking out in hopes that other parents will speak out when they see things like this, because I think that people are afraid to, and we need to empower them to bring awareness. And I want to know, how long has this been going on in the school system? And what is it in the 6th grade? Is it in the 8th grade? Is it in other curriculum?
How do you feel about your daughter? I'm sure you're proud of her.
I'm so proud of her, because I know that she felt so bad when she was given this and knowing her parents' beliefs. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. This is a huge issue.
Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is the face of democratic socialism. And since her brain is as empty as the promises of unfettered statism, I am absolutely fine with that. Every time she makes another gaffe, it only highlights how horrible the system is and how the bubble-wrapped utopian pipe dream that has been sold like Florida swampland to gullible college students will ultimately implode from its own dead weight. AOC supposedly has an economics degree, which I imagine she got through the mail by clipping box tops off her Panda Puff cereal, because she certainly didn't have to sit through any classes, or some rational nuggets would have seeped into her brain through accidental osmosis. She misread an article from The Nation where a Michigan State economics professor documented $21 trillion in unsupported accounting adjustments from the Department of Defense. That means money was moving mysteriously in and out through an opaque budgetary system, and it's impossible to see what cancels each other out. Of course, Alexandria's reading comprehension is as solid as her basic math, so she took that to mean the Pentagon was hiding $21 trillion in a camouflage steamer trunk, and if she could find it and pry it open, it would almost single-handedly fund single-payer insurance. She tweeted, quote, 21 trillion of Pentagon financial transactions could not be traced, documented, or explained. 21T in Pentagon accounting errors. Medicare for all costs tilde 32T. That means 66% of Medicare for all could have been funded already by the Pentagon. And that's before our premiums. Oh dear. That's not how it works. The total Pentagon budget for the 17-year period the study covers was only $9 trillion, and that's a lot of money. But there's not some magical stash you can trade for Band-Aids and aspirins in the cellar. My problem isn't with how Miss Ocasio-Cortez looks, or what she wears, or how she talks. It's that she has been thrown so many softballs, leftist interviewers are getting group rate discounts on Tommy John surgery, and she never corrects her fundamental flaws or does basic research to fix her fuzzy math. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez called her the future of the Democratic Party. And I hope, like this recent flirtation with diet communism, that future is short-lived and soon corrected. And that's the memo.
There are people like my sect of Islam which taught us that Islam is a religion of peace. The slogan of our sect of Islam was love for all, hatred for none. So we were taught to love everyone, and that Islam truly was a religion of peace. So when I told people Islam is a religion of peace, when I saw 9/11 happen and those buildings getting knocked down, my response was, how could this happen in the name of my faith? Literally, who hijacked my faith and those planes to make Islam look violent? It was at that time that I started investigating this matter deeply, because I started conversing with friends, and they would say things like, well, you've got verses in the Quran that are rather violent. For example, chapter 9, verse 5. Lay siege to the infidels, take them captive, and kill them wherever you find them. That's kind of violent. I'd say, yeah, but that was in a context of a war where the Muslims were trying to defend themselves. And so that wasn't a violent verse, that was a verse about defense, and that was the context. But was it? As I started investigating, I truly did believe that the context was all defensive battles in the Quran. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that was simply not the case. Chapter 9, verse 5. So chapter 9 is the most violent chapter of the Quran. It's Surah At-Tawbah. And this is the very same chapter which says, fight the Jews and Christians until they pay the jizya and feel humiliated. Just chapter 9, verse 29. This is the same chapter in chapter 9, verse 111, and I think this is one of the scariest verses of the Quran. Chapter 9, verse 111 says, the reason Allah has bought your person and your property is this, so you may slay in battle and be slain. In other words, you're a Muslim, so you can kill and die in battle. And so I had to contextualize that. Somehow I had to say, this cannot be what Muslims are told to do. But as I studied the history of early Islam, I found out that actually, chapter 9 of the Quran is the last major chapter to have been revealed. In other words, right before Muhammad dies, it's as if he calls people to his deathbed and says, I've got some more instructions to give you. That's just a metaphorical language I'm using, but it's like, this is the last message I want to leave with you. Chapter 9 of the Quran. the most violent one there is. When we consider the Bible, and people will say, well, what ISIS is doing, didn't Obama say something like this recently? What ISIS is doing is no better or no worse than the Crusades. It's no better or no worse than what happened in Christian history. I say, no. You got to keep things in their appropriate context. In the Bible, the violence did happen. We cannot sidestep it, and you didn't ask this question, so if someone else wants to ask it, that's fine. But there was violence in the Old Testament, and there's specific circumstances and things that we should talk about with that, so someone please ask. But it did not end up that way. That wasn't the final marching order of God. What we were left with was turn the other cheek. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Give your enemy something to drink if they're thirsty. That's what we were left with. Complete grace and peace. Flip that around for Islam. In the Meccan days of Islamic history, the message was very, very peaceful. Jews, Christians, Sabians, all of you, if you do good deeds and good works and you fear God, on the last day for you is heaven. Whereas towards the end, we start hearing things like anyone who comes before Allah without Islam as their religion will not be accepted. It goes the other direction. So how do we distill all this? There's also the matter of Islamic traditions, hadith. You know, we I'm guessing most of us here are Protestant. There may be Catholics, you'll understand this as well. Protestants have kind of a sola scriptura lens. It's like the Bible is my authority and that's it. Muslims are not like that. The Quran is their greatest authority, sure, but then they have whole swaths of Islamic tradition called hadith. And the hadith are the lens through which the Quran is often applied. So Sunni Muslims often use books like Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, in order to see how Muhammad lived. What was it that he did? By the way, Muhammad's name is only mentioned 4 times in the Quran. Now, it's not a book of history about Muhammad's life. So people go to the hadith to see how Muhammad lived. And because there are so many hadith, people can point to the peaceful ones and say, that's how Islam should be. And you got people like ISIS pointing to the violent ones saying, that's how Islam should be. Who is right? Who is right? And can you make Islam whatever you want to make it? My concluding statement here is that peaceful Muslims who say Islam is a religion of peace are not lying to you. They honestly believe it. I did. But they haven't investigated the original sources, or at least they have done so in a way that wasn't faithful to the timeline of events. Early Islam was, in fact, rather violent. Islam, even under Muhammad's time, did have offensive wars against Jews and Christians. And that rendering of Islamic history is what leads people to diligently or faithfully live a violent Islam. I hesitate to say this, but I think it's true. If I still believed in Islam, and if I wanted to be faithful to Muhammad, I would have a hard time not going to Syria right now to fight for ISIS. It seems like they're doing what Islam commands.
These young people say Jordan Peterson should not be allowed to speak on their campus. Peterson's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto. When Canada proposed a law declaring it illegal not to call someone by their preferred pronoun, in other words, illegal not to address those who don't want to be called he or she, as say Z or Zim, Peterson said he would not obey that law.
Shame on you! Shame, shame, shame on you!
It's not just students who object. Hundreds of his colleagues signed a petition demanding that Peterson be fired. They say his behavior is a danger.
This is where we draw the line! This is where we draw the line!
Now, when he tries to speak, protesters often surround him, blowing air horns or screaming to make sure others cannot hear him. At this school, he and students who wanted to hear him moved outside to escape the noise. But the protesters just followed him and drowned him out again. If somebody wants to be called Z or Zer, why not?
I don't care what people want to be called, that's fine, but that doesn't mean I should be compelled by law to call them that. The government has absolutely no business whatsoever, ever, governing the content of your voluntary speech.
But if I personally said, I'd like you to call me Z or Zen.
We could have a conversation about that, just like I would if you asked me to use a nickname, for example. But there's a big difference between privately negotiated modes of address and legislatively demanded compelled speech.
Protesters call Peterson all sorts of names.
They've called me lots of things. Hitler, that was one. The fact that it has to do with transgender people is virtually irrelevant. The issue is compelled speech.
Peterson handles the protesters well. And you look pretty calm while they're screaming at you.
Yeah, well, better to be calm.
Best to let the unreasonable opposition speak, because they manifest themselves as unreasonable, and then everyone can see it.
You can also see it in this video, viewed millions of times. Maybe because Peterson stays calm while the TV host keeps twisting his words.
You're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No, I didn't say that at all.
He simply says that natural differences explain most of the gender wage gap.
Do you believe in equal pay?
Well, I made the argument there. It's like it depends on
So
who
you don't
defines
believe
it.
in equal pay?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Like many on the left, she insists that difference proves discrimination. If it weren't for our sexist society, we'd be much more alike.
That's actually not the case. The science on that is absolutely clear. They've studied tens of thousands of people in dozens of countries, and the papers have been cited thousands of times.
For years, many leftists denied there were any differences. Aren't women in general better nurturers?
No. Next question.
Feminist icon Gloria Steinem even objected to researching differences.
It's really the remnant of anti-American crazy thinking to do this kind of research.
But more research has been done, and it shows that on average, men and women excel at different things.
That runs contrary to the desires of the researchers who generated the data, because no one wanted that. It came as a shock to everyone, but that's how it is.
And yet when you say this, it infuriates some people.
No, it should infuriate them, because I'm going right after the heart of the radical leftist doctrine.
The heart of that doctrine is that all groups should have equal outcomes. There should be just as many female CEOs, scientists, computer programmers, because men and women are the same. If outcomes differ, it must be sexism. Or, as actress Ashley Judd puts it,
the problem is the patriarchy.
The patriarchy. Professors teach exactly that.
The United States is a patriarchal society.
First of all, I think the idea that men tyrannically dominated everything is a pretty damn weak argument. The year 2000 to the year 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by 50%. It's like, that's pretty good for a patriarchal tyranny. That was the fastest economic development in the history of the world.
But on campus, the message is inequality, oppression. Students major now in social justice.
Disciplines like women's and ethnic studies, which are corrupt right to the core.
I pledge to use they and them when I do not know someone's pronouns.
They're out to produce radical leftist activists by their own admission. All you have to do is go to the websites of these disciplines and look at how they advertise.
Social justice is different from justice. Social justice generally means justice for groups of people. It assumes every group, men, women, blacks, whites, should have the same income, job preference, everything. Peterson says this is an idea that comes from Marxist professors. It's a little discredited now to say I'm a Marxist.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? Except I think it's 1 in 5 social scientists identify as Marxist. So yeah, it's a little discredited, but it's nowhere near discredited enough. It should be as discreditable to say that you're a Marxist as it is to say that you're a Nazi.
It isn't. On campus, socialism is cherished, says Peterson, although it's murderous.
We've got 100 million corpses stacked up to demonstrate.
Murderous then, but they say Stalin is a bad individual. Doesn't mean that.
Yeah, so was Mao, so was Pol Pot. The thing is it was tried everywhere, and the end consequence was always the same. I've heard this all many, many times. That wasn't real communism. You know what that means? That means that if I would have been the benevolent dictator in the place of Stalin, then I would have brought in the utopia. There isn't a more narcissistic and toxic and inexcusable statement that you can possibly make.
We actually value the individual.
Peterson offers an alternative in videos that suddenly are being viewed by millions.
The individual has intrinsic value.
Peterson calls for the opposite of Marxism, individual sovereignty.
The free market principles, the idea of individual sovereignty above all else, has distributed itself across the world quite effectively, and everyone is doing better here than anybody has ever done on the face of the planet throughout recorded history, and the whole West is like that. And to call that all a tyrannical patriarchy is indicative of a very deep resentment and a historical ignorance that's so profound that it's indistinguishable from willful blindness.
Peterson says the best thing people can do to fight back against that blindness is to speak the truth, even when it's unpopular. Peterson follows his own advice. He says unpopular truths, and people like that. Almost 1 million have bought his book.
Well, thank you very much. You've doubtless all heard that the Great Barrier Reef is on its last legs, and it's been smothered by sediment, polluted by fertiliser and pesticides, and it's killed by dredging and, of course, climate change. So who here, put your hands up, believes that story is true as a matter of interest? Right. Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, out there, almost everybody believes it true. There's literally hundreds of millions of people around the world who think that. So you guys now have got a little bit of a tricky question, because you've been told it's dead and you believe it's dead. So how are you going to tell this? Am I a whistleblower, and the world has been conned, or am I a complete lunatic? And of course, the way you decide is that you'll listen to my arguments, that this is the libertarian way. But unfortunately, that's not the way of a modern university, as we will see in a minute. So I'll give you, before we go into my little tricky situation with the university, I'll give you some facts about the reef. Climate change is supposed to be killing all the corals, but did you know that most of the corals that live on the Great Barrier Reef also live in Indonesia and Thailand, where the water is 1 or 2 degrees hotter, and they actually grow 50% faster there, in fact probably more. Coral bleaching, which you've heard such a lot about, is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for 100 million years or so. It's like a bushfire. It looks terrible, but the corals rapidly recover from it. You would have heard statistics like 1/3 of the reef has died in the 2016 mass bleaching event. Well, actually, when you look at the statistics in a great deal of detail, and you've got to dig deep, I can tell you, you find that probably about 5% of the coral was died, maybe 10% if you really stretch the numbers ridiculously. That sounds like a lot of coral, but consider that between 2011 and 2016, the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef, the amount of coral increased by 250%. So the change of 5% or 10% downwards doesn't add up to a hill of beans. Sediment is supposed to be smothering the reef, and this is one of my area of expertise, because I was actually involved with inventing the instruments that have measured sediment out on reefs. So my group has done more measurements of sediment on the reef than anybody else, and probably everybody else put together. Turns out that there's about 100 times more sediment that gets resuspended from waves and goes onto the reef than comes down all the rivers from all the farms put together. And it's that wave stirring that's most important. And of course, then you have cyclones. Well, they suspend so much sediment, it's just not funny. If you actually go out to the Great Barrier Reef, you're flat out even finding a single grain of sediment on the reef itself that comes from land. And you can tell whether it comes from land because the sediment on the reef is made out of broken down calcium carbonate, coral skeletons, totally different composition. And the sediment from land just isn't out there. Dredging is also supposed to be killing the reef, but in the last 2 decades, a couple of $100 million has been spent monitoring dredging operations to see how much it kills. And basically, apart from 1 or 2 in Western Australia where they actually dredge through a reef, you're flat out measuring even a single coral that dies in most of these things. And on that one where they did drill through the reef, they found that the effect of dredging goes maybe 2 or 3 kilometres. But most of the reefs on the Great Barrier Reef are, well, on average 1,000 kilometres from a particular port, and are almost always between 50 and 100 kilometres from the nearest port, so they really are not affected. Coral growth rates have increased by 10% since the 1940s. Pesticides never get out to the reef in quantities that would affect the reef. In fact, they're in such low quantities you can barely even measure them, even with the most accurate scientific instruments. Crown of thorns starfish are entirely natural, and sediment cores indicate that there have been plagues of them around for time immemorial. They are not like cats or tame cane toads. They are actually a native Australian species, just like a kangaroo or an echidna. Coral certainly fluctuates in coral cover over time, but the amount of coral that we've got now is not significantly different to when records properly started to begin in the 1985. But the scientific consensus is that the whole thing is on its last legs, and this is a big deal now if you're from North Queensland, because every single one of our major industries is affected by restrictions caused by the supposed demise of the Great Barrier Reef. Sugar, cattle, mining, port dredging, and the tourist industry, because the whole world knows that the reef is dead, so why bother coming? So the question is, how could this all be so wrong? It sounds like a bit of a crazy story, that so many scientists could be wrong, and I'm the only one. I'm not the only one, by the way, but I'm one of the few who thinks that this is all a load of rubbish. Well, I've actually got some bad news for you. This is not the only area where scientists get it wrong. Who here has heard of the replication crisis? Hands up. Who here has not heard of the replication crisis? All right. Well, frankly, shame on you, because it's the biggest thing in science in the last 40 years. But you do have an excuse, right? The replication crisis is where we're finding, when we try to repeat science that's already been done, we find it's wrong half the time, right? So this is why you've never heard of it, because scientists don't tend to like to blow the trumpet on this one too much. Can you imagine any other profession where it's wrong half the time? You know, perhaps flying an aeroplane. Aeroplanes only crash half the time. Right? Now, this is just not me saying this, all right? This is the big journals and the big national science organisations. We're talking about this. Possibly the most famous quote on this is by a chap called Horton in the leading medical journal, The Lancet. Very famous. He said, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, flagrant conflicts of interest together with an obsession for fashionable ideas of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness." And then John Ioannidis from Stanford University, who in my view is actually the father of the replication crisis, wrote a very famous paper which has been cited more than any other paper in the last few years, called "Why Most Published Findings Is False." He reckons that we're wasting about 85% of our science resources following bad science effectively down a rat hole. So yes, scientists can get it wrong, and they can get it a lot wrong, and a lot of scientists can get it all wrong on one particular thing without any problems. All right, so how did this get me into a spot of bother? Well, for the IPA, I wrote a chapter in the book on climate change and how climate change affects the reef, or doesn't affect the reef. The IPA organised an interview with the Alan Jones where I said the words to the effect that in the light of the replication crisis, which shows about a 50% failure rate, if organisations use solely peer review as their checking mechanism, then their results could not be trusted. 50% isn't trustworthy. Now, it was a tough thing that I said, and I named a couple of organisations, and I did not expect them to be particularly happy with that. I expected them to argue. You know, Peter, you're wrong because, well, whatever. But what actually happened, well, I was called into my dean's office and given a brown envelope with allegations of serious misconduct. By the way, serious misconduct, the difference between serious and normal misconduct is you can be fired for serious. So they chose that one. They told to keep all the allegations secret. In my view, that was in total contravention of my work contract. I contacted the IPA just to let them know what was going on, and they were very generous and they gave me some legal help, and there was quite a bit of legal to and fro. JC was very insistent that everything was kept secret. the legal things were going pretty well for that, for me, I thought. But then I got called up to the Dean's office a second time and given 25 more serious misconduct allegations, mostly for not keeping things secret. They trawled through my emails. They had no reason to do it. They trawled through my emails for dirt. They read every single one. And I can tell you that you start to sweat when you're reading a 128-page document of allegations which they've dredged from your emails. You wonder, well, what have I said? And when I got to the end of it, I breathed a huge sigh of release because I'd actually not said anything that I was ashamed of, which was a surprise. But some of the allegations were really incredible. They objected to me emailing my wife. In another email, this was emailing my wife about the allegations. In another email, I complained to a friend that the university was Orwellian for not allowing me free speech. So JCU then read my emails and complained that I was not allowed to call them Orwellian. I thought it must have been a joke, that they actually had some sorts of sense of humour, but actually they just didn't realise that they had proven themselves to be Orwellian and that Big Brother really was watching me. I'll show that they had a sense of humour a little bit as well. The case dragged on for some time, legal to and fro, and it was draining resources, but we decided to file in court to fight it, right? In my opinion, at that stage, the university wasn't expecting us to do that, and they certainly weren't expecting the fight or the really bad publicity that was coming about. So as soon as we filed, within a day or so, they gave me a final censure, your last thing, and told me to keep it secret. Except to my wife, they agreed that I could talk to her, which was nice of them. And I confess at first that I'd got away with it, right? Well, I hadn't been fired, and I really thought I was going to get fired. And I was inclined to accept it. The final censure, I'd kept my job. We'd fought the battle to a draw, and my wife disagreed, in fact. She said, "You are now silenced, and JCU has you where they want you to be, with a gun to your head, with the final censure, and a muzzle on your mouth." I couldn't really say anything without taking the risk that I was going to get fired. And she was dead right. Within a short time, I was supposed to give a talk at the Sydney Institute and the IPA, as I recall, and the JCU insisted on reading my PowerPoint presentations, and they asked for some parts to be removed and other parts to be modified. And when I did give the lecture at the Sydney Institute, some people asked some questions, and I found that I actually couldn't answer the questions because of the restrictions that had been placed on me. So we weighed this up for a little while, but in the end, there was just no choice. We had to fight. What they were doing was wrong, and we were going to fight it, even though we knew that this was going to raise the ire of JCU even more and take a considerable risk. So with the great assistance of the IPA, especially Matt Lesh over here, we went for a GoFundMe campaign to raise $100,000 for the required legal assistance. And we got that $100,000 in 2 days with a GoFundMe, which was fun. And there may be some people here. It was incredibly nerve-wracking, but it was also a bit exciting as well, right? Seeing the money rack up. Now, to do that, I had to put all the information on the website, everything. All the allegations, all 40-odd, at this stage, 27 charges against me. And I did that because, well, firstly, I have a right to do that, in my view. Secondly, the public have a right to know what a public university is doing with their money. And thirdly, you can't say to people who you're trying to get some money off, JCU has accused me for 27 counts of serious misconduct, please give me $100,000, but I can't tell you what it is about. Remember, these donors know I work at a university. I could have been touching up the first year ladies. They need to know everything, so I have to, well, it's true, isn't it? That's what people think. We're talking about 27 cases of serious misconduct. People start to wonder, well, what has this guy done? And that's why I had to tell people, hey guys, it's nothing bad, all right? I just said some things. All right, well, the GoFundMe campaign made JC really angry, especially as there was lots of very adverse publicity. So there was a third meeting with the Dean, and I was given another brown envelope with a dozen or so new allegations. Again, they claimed that I broke the illegal secrecy directive, and they trawled up other matters, all of which I put online so that other people could judge whether I was guilty or not. My favourite allegation was an email I sent to an old friend, an ex-college, with the subject line of the email, "For your amusement." And I attached a newspaper article about my case, which was fairly uncomplimentary to JCU. And I didn't say anything else, right? JCU claimed that for just sending that with "for your amusement," I'd broken the rule in our enterprise bargaining agreement that I'm not allowed to parody, vilify, or satirise the disciplinary process. And by saying "for amusement," I'd done that. I've never heard anything more pathetic in my life. I must say, I laughed when I read that one. Well, anyway, it dragged on more to and fro with the legal people, and I was finally fired. I was actually sitting under a palm tree in Bamaga on the tip of Cape York Peninsula when I got the phone call from the HR manager, and he was jolly nice about it. And he offered me counselling just in case I was a bit upset about things, right? So we said, to hell with that. We're going to go for another GoFundMe. We needed more cash, and we got $160,000 in 3 days. So thank you all for that much too. During the 10 months that this was going on, there was considerable media interest, which was almost all entirely unfavourable to the JCU. And I managed the incredible feat, I'm very proud of this, I managed to get Andrew Bolt to agree with the ABC. And also Breitbart to agree with the Guardian newspaper. That was how bad the publicity was for the university. Now, you may wonder why JCU was so keen to keep all the allegations secret, and you may think that it was because JCU might have think that it would reflect badly on them. But actually, by enforcing the secrecy provision, the illegal secrecy provision, the victim cannot get help and cannot organise resistance. The secrecy provision is a powerful tool to control the academics, or in this case the proletariat, I guess. If I had not been able to talk to the IPA or do the GoFundMe campaign, I could never have got the legal help. I would have been fired much sooner, and I would have had no hope of fighting back. So that's why the secrecy provision we're fighting so hard, because it means that people can't fight back. I won't go into any much more detail on this. The court case will be held in mid-November. The court case will not be fought on common decency. If it was, I would win. I've no doubt about that. But it's on the legal definition of the enterprise bargaining agreement. I know I'm off by heart. 54.1.5, Section C is what it's going to be fought on. But anyway, we've got a good chance of success. We've got an excellent legal system, but it's not certain. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, that enterprise bargaining agreement does apply to other universities, or at least parts of it. So what will happen if I win? Well, actually, all it proves is that if you could raise 260 grand of other people's money with a huge amount of help from the IPA and lawyers, a lot of grey hairs and angst, you might get your job back. So what will other academics think? Well, they're going to say, whatever you do, don't do what Peter Ridd did, right? Just don't go towards the edge of that cliff. So academic freedom is thus effectively dead, although there'll be this fiction because the judge might have upheld my case. The process will be the punishment, and the administrators will have got their own way. On the other hand, if I lose, well, that'll be bad, but we will at least have a court proclaim, in my view.
This video is sponsored by Dashley.
Freedom, because the university will have effectively written into the enterprise bargaining agreement that it is dead, but by these other provisions that they've put in. So we will know exactly where we stand, and to be frank, it's been pretty obvious for the last couple of decades that academic freedom has been dead. But we will have closure, as they say nowadays, and we can go ahead and bury the corpse. Academic freedom, born in Bologna 1088, on life support since 1990, pronounced dead in 2018, will be fondly remembered. So you might wonder, well, would the academics care? Well, not really. Remember, about 80% of the academics, at least, would be on the cultural left. Of the remainder, maybe only 10%, mostly in the engineering and hard science area, would be working in potentially, not in those areas, would be working in potentially controversial fields. So they're not worried. So of those 2%, of the remaining 2%, there'll only be a few who will firstly have sort of the personality to fight, will have no mortgage and good superannuation. Now, I'm at the end of my career, so it doesn't really matter. People say it's brave. It's not brave. I'm near the end. I'm near retirement. In fact, there's a responsibility for people in my position to take these risks. But anyway, what you end up with is about 1 in 1,000 academics who are actually effective and willing to fight to do anything about it. So don't expect a groundswell from the academics. So the big question, is academic freedom already dead in name? Well, probably. Do we give up on universities being the main...
As a YouTuber who makes videos about the Earth's environment, and specifically climate, I receive a lot of comments from people who dispute the influence humanity has on the natural world. One particular argument which gets brought up again and again is something along the lines of, why haven't sea levels risen? A frequent prediction of anthropogenic climate change is that mean sea levels will rise, threatening coastal communities, causing mass migration, and apparently the end of the world? It certainly doesn't feel like that's happened. So in this video, let's review the data on global sea levels and work out if humans are actually changing anything. First of all, let's look at some data from coastal tide gauges. Not satellite data, nothing fancy, an actual physical set of gauges at multiple locations around the world. Do these measurements show any sea level... Oh, wow, yeah they do. The gauges show nearly 25 centimetres of mean sea level rise from 1880 to 2013. Sea levels have been rising a lot. But the term sea level rise isn't actually terribly useful when talking about climate change, because if you look at historical data from, among other things, coral cores, it's clear that mean sea levels have been rising for around 20,000 years. As this figure suggests, this is a result of the Earth coming out of the last glacial maximum, what you might call the most recent ice age. About 20,000 years ago, the Earth started warming, largely due to cyclical variations in its orbit around the Sun, called Milankovitch cycles, though there were likely other factors. As the Earth warmed, which we can see very clearly in proxy data like ice cores, sea levels rose rapidly due to ice sheets melting and pouring into the ocean basins. Water that had previously been locked up as ice, including a huge amount as ice on land, entered the oceans and increased their volume. When these ice sheets retreated, the landscape significantly changed, making, for example, the British Isles separate from mainland Europe. Returning to the figure, we're very much at the tail end of this interglacial sea level rise, which appears to be either completely static or decreasing in pace, but still changing the mean sea level. A smart question to ask then is, given this background sea level rise, the Earth coming out of the last glacial maximum, has humanity changed the rate of sea level rise? In other words, by influencing the climate through emitting greenhouse gases like CO2, have we as a species accelerated sea level rise? Well, we have a time series of mean sea level stretching back to 1880. The hypothesis is that humans have increased the rate of sea level rise since then. In terms of this graph, that the rate of sea level rise, the slope, is greater at the end of the time series than at the start. Clearly, the sea level hasn't risen by the same amount every year. There are plenty of wiggles. So let's take an average over a long period of time. Let's compare the average sea level rise in the first 30 years of data to the average sea level rise in the last 30 years of data. If I was being rigorous, then I'd test if my conclusions were sensitive to the length of time considered, but I leave that as an exercise for the viewer. In the first 30 years, sea level rose by an average of 1.31 millimeters per year. In the last 30 years, the sea level rose by 2.5 millimeters per year. So what could have caused this increase? Factors which are known to have caused previous sea level change, Milankovitch cycles and continental drift, operate on long timescales and haven't been observed to change significantly over the past century. Another mechanism that could have forced this increase is variation in solar output, the total solar irradiance. Over the past century, this has increased, but by less than 0.1%. Not enough to have forced observed acceleration of sea level rise. That leaves one further mechanism known to alter sea levels: changes in radiative forcing. Over the past century, the concentration of radiatively active greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have changed significantly due to human emissions, altering the Earth's energy budget. The resulting increase in global average temperature causes both increased melt of ice sheets, like Antarctica and Greenland, but also thermal expansion of the oceans. If you heat up water, it expands in volume ever so slightly. This is well-known physics. This isn't noticeable on small scales, but when you expand an entire ocean ever so slightly, the results are absolutely measurable. So we have observational evidence that sea level rise has accelerated, and that natural forcings have not varied sufficiently on the timescale of observations. Therefore, we're left to conclude that our hypothesis that humans have accelerated sea level rise is correct. But this was just me messing around with one time series for 10 minutes. There is an entire scientific literature using lots of data sources, including global satellite altimetry, because sea level rise isn't the same everywhere, and more powerful statistical techniques to establish that, yes, sea levels started rising more rapidly around the turn of the 20th century, and that this rate of change has likely continually increased over the past 100 years. So we can be pretty sure that humans have accelerated global sea level rise, but only by a couple of millimeters per year. That hardly matches up with the predictions of the future looking like Kevin Costner's Waterworld. By which I mean terrible. Well, there are two parts as to why. Firstly, no serious scientist has claimed that we would all be underwater or living on atolls or trimarans by the present day. Many of the scientific predictions that are mocked by climate change deniers have either been hyped out of all recognition from serious research or outright fabricated. I had a mate who used to do exactly this. He would hype up stories about me to the point where he could start mocking me for spreading such outlandish tales about myself to our friends. For the record, for those of you who knew me from uni, I never actually single-handedly saved a girl from drowning by abseiling bare-chested into the river. That was Rob's version of the story. Secondly, previous predictions of sea level rise actually match up fairly well with what we've observed. The very first IPCC report in 1990 made a series of predictions of sea level rise by the present day, and satellite observations are right in the middle of their predictions for the first 26 years, showing slightly less sea level rise than their best guess at the time. Current estimates still have uncertainties attached, but much smaller ones, as we understand the systems much better, and as our models for predicting sea level rise add new complexity and more physical systems, our estimates, as well as getting more accurate, get higher and higher. It's considered very likely that sea levels in the year 2100 will be between 30 and 130 centimeters higher than in the year 2000. And a lot of scientists consider that to be too conservative an estimate. In other words, the acceleration of sea level rise that we've observed humans cause to date is only the thin end of the wedge. Sea levels are going to rise faster and faster every decade, and by the end of the century, the impacts are going to be very real. So to answer the question in the video's title, sea levels have been rising every decade, and in fact the sea level has been rising faster every decade. Scientists understand the physical systems behind this increase in sea level and have seen their predictions borne out by observations thus far. And the acceleration of sea level rise that we humans cause is going to continue for the foreseeable future, committing us to potentially more than a meter of sea level rise by the end of the century. This will put coastal populations at risk of inundation, species at risk of extinction, something we think that's already happened actually, and economies around the world, especially those of island nations, at risk of going under. And that's just this century. We are committed to further warming and further sea level rise for centuries to come. Every ton of greenhouse gas that we emit into the atmosphere now only makes that long-term change worse. We can, of course, adapt to changes in our environment. We are a hardy species. But why make the lives of our descendants, generations yet unborn, more difficult, perhaps even impossibly difficult, when we can take action now? See the description for my video on what we can do today to enable meaningful change in our climate outlook. Thanks to Dashlane, also linked in the description, for supporting my climate change-based content on this channel. Their support allows me to make videos like this one. Dashlane is a service that keeps you safe online by generating extremely strong passwords for your various online accounts, and then remembering them for you. Only you have access to your store of passwords, which are accessible with your unique master password, and they're kept safe and secure behind patented security software. Your passwords, absolutely essential to digital life, are better